into 70 AD. So yeah.
So you would even say the Son of Man coming on the clouds, and the I guess you could say the coming in the glory and all that stuff.
Right. Yeah.
And now, would you correlate that? I guess. With the kingdom of God coming as well, or what would, I mean?
Well, you're basically asking me how I would interpret the language of like the Son of Man coming in the clouds?
I mean, I know.
Is that what you're
you
asking?
you would interpret it as like, I guess, like the Roman army, like something like that, right?
Well, it's a. I mean, I would probably give a little bit more nuanced answer than that. The thing about the coming in the clouds language and the coming in, somebody coming in his kingdom, that kind of language is used in the Gospels. My understanding, and this isn't even really something that's even unique to like historicism. I've heard preterist, partial and full, kind of go along the same lines. Although full, well, I guess the full preterism would be a little bit different because you guys would understand that as actually referring to like the second advent, whereas like a partial preterist or historicist would not view it as being the same as that. But my understanding would be that when we look at the language that Christ is using throughout the Gospels when he talks about the Son of Man coming in his kingdom or coming in the clouds, this is Old Testament language that's being borrowed from a couple of different places, especially in the context of Matthew 24, because what we find in Matthew 24 is this is obviously, and it's not just 24, it's even in 22 through 23 through 24, that entire section makes reference to the judgment on Jerusalem. But especially within that judgment context, that apocalyptic context, the cloud rider motif is really common even in the Old Testament with Jehovah riding on the clouds. And this is just a very common way that the Israelites speak. You know, David uses this language in like 2 Samuel 22 when he talks about being delivered from the hand of Saul. You know, he says that Jehovah bowed the heavens and came down on a cherub, you know, and I mean, when Isaiah's prophesying about, you know, the Assyrian army coming in and sacking Egypt, he says that Jehovah is riding on the cloud and is coming into Egypt, you know, so there's this kind of, it's associated with judgment, like with God visiting a people in judgment. Now, the distinction in Matthew 24 is imagery. He's talking now about the Son of Man being the cloud rider, which also has to do and is an obvious allusion back to Daniel 7. And so what a lot of partial preterists and historicists, because there's some overlap between people, would say is that when you get to Daniel 7, now you have the Son of Man being given authority by the Ancient of Days over every tribe, tongue, nation, and people. And now he's the cloud rider. And the cloud riding in that section specifically is talking about the ascension. So in either case, the cloud rider motif in the Gospels, we would say, really doesn't have anything to do with the second advent. Rather, it has to do with Christ's enthronement and his subsequent messianic activity in heaven, his exercising his authority and his dominion, you know, over the nations, basically. So when he talks about, you know, in Matthew 24, he says that the inhabitants of Jerusalem are going to see the Son of Man coming in the clouds, right? Well, how are they going to see it? How are they going to perceive that? Is it with their bodily eyes, or is it some other way? We would say it's with some other way. The way that they're going to perceive or see the Son of Man coming in the clouds is when he destroys their city. You know, he's going to show them that he's the Son of Man from Daniel 7, the Messiah that they were rejecting. You know, and it's a similar idea with elsewhere with Matthew 26, for instance. You know, Matthew 26 is a really interesting one because he's telling that to the Sanhedrin. You know, he does the same thing. I am, and from this time forward, you will see the Son of Man coming in the clouds and seated at the right hand of power. You know, and we know that that has a specific reference to the ascension because in Luke's account, you have him just saying, "I am the Christ," and from this time forward, the Son of Man will be seated at the right hand of God. So obviously, you know, the Sanhedrin wasn't going to ascend up into heaven and see him with their bodily eyes, you know, seated next to God, you know. So the language there from our perspective, we would say that this has nothing to do with the second advent. It's apocalyptic imagery, language being borrowed from the Old Testament, to communicate something different.
Gotcha.
But so far, does that kind of answer the question?
Yeah, I would agree on all that as well. So okay. I guess, okay, so one of the biggest things that I saw in that video that John had sent me was understanding that the Pope's office, that is the whore, or the Roman Catholic Church is the whore. And then through that lens is interpreted pretty much Daniel and Revelation and things like that.
Yeah, it's more, so the understanding of the identity of Antichrist, again, is a little bit more nuanced to it than that. It's not so much that we would start with the presupposition that the Pope is the Antichrist or something. It has more to do
not just not the Antichrist, but the whore.
Yeah,
the whore.
Yeah, sure. We would say that's the Roman Catholic institution. Yeah.
Now, So when I saw because the guy went through a lot of different interpretations of eschatology that he gave futurist, historicism, partial preterist, full preterism, things like that, and when he said, of course to him the historicism is the most consistent, and he kept saying about the reformers and all this stuff that throughout church era, so many people believe that it was the Roman Catholic Pope and that office, not a specific Pope, but just the office itself. Right. That is the whore. He posted the little pictures with the purple garments and things like that, saying look how obvious this is. This is what Revelation 17 is talking about. This is the whore, the one that is drunk on the blood of the martyrs. Okay. So, using the Bible, how do you stay consistent and see that? Whenever you see
I think the answer to that would lie in what I was going to say previously about how we arrive at the conclusions we arrive at. And this is kind of the thing about the whole discussion is, in my opinion anyway, the thing I've realized is it's very difficult to sort of start with one aspect of this because, and not that that's wrong or anything, but just that when you're dealing with a subject as broad as eschatology, there's a bunch of different factors involved, and how a person's going to come to a conclusion, right? So, for instance, for those who don't know in the call, I don't know how much maybe you might have told them, but I was a partial preterist for a while. And I think personally, I'm of the opinion that Rome and Jerusalem are probably the two most likely candidates for Revelation 17. Because you can make a very compelling case, and I know because I was the preterist at one point, that Jerusalem, she killed the prophets. She, was even the colors purple and scarlet are associated with her and all this other stuff. The thing that made me change my mind was when I assessed the other sort of, I guess you could say, the other pillars, if you will, or the other, key prophetic passages and concepts and things that led me to that conclusion to begin with. So when it comes to how we're identifying the harlot, Babylon, it's based upon a lot of other considerations. So, for instance, our understanding of the book of Daniel, because Daniel and Revelation are intrinsically, they're connected. That's going to influence how we're viewing this as well. So from a historicist standpoint, we would say that, if and most commentators would agree, I don't know of a whole lot of people who subscribe to the more, the more quote unquote scholarly or academic viewpoint that Rome isn't even in the book of Daniel. I don't know if anyone here takes that position. But most would agree that Rome is in some way connected to the fourth beast in the book of Daniel. And, if we don't agree with the idea that all of the prophecies in Revelation were fulfilled by the first century, right, then there's some rather obvious room for extending that into not just papal or pagan Rome, but into papal Rome as well, and there's a lot of indications there that we can just extrapolate.
What gives the justification to go past the first century?
So yeah, there would be a couple of different considerations there. If we're talking about just the Book of Revelation itself, part of it would be assessing the specific claims made by the preterist side, right? That it has to all be confined to the first century, and then the other side of it would be, like I said, a more careful consideration of the biblical data. And each of those considerations, I feel like I could name them, and you're gonna, we would have to take some time to probably debate each and every one of those considerations if I named them. But we could start with, like, for instance, if we took a look at the Book of Revelation, for example, just by itself, we know, if we're just looking at the book without trying to necessarily give a specific interpretation to it, that there is at least, by the time you get to chapter 20, at least 1,000-year gap mentioned. Now, whether you want to, that's not really to comment on, the amillennial, postmillennial, premillennial issue, but just something like that, for instance, that's something that would indicate that the book was intended to extend past the first century. Now, I'm aware of the main preterist interpretation. I don't know what you guys think of that, but from my understanding, most preterists try to turn that into a 40-year period that started before the Book of Revelation was written. I don't know if you hold to that, and we don't have to get into a huge debate on that right this instant, but I would have objections to something like that, but I would say that would be one indication of that. But there's other indicators as well.
Do you take it as Do you take it as a literal 1,000 years?
Well, I currently lean towards a postmillennial viewpoint, personally. So, from my standpoint, it doesn't make a huge difference if it's literal or not. I do think that there are some valid points for why it would be literal. But it's not like a make or break thing for me if it's just a symbolic, number or something.
Yeah. So hypothetically speaking, we go with that logic that it's a symbolic number. What is the problem with going past 70 AD then?
Sure. Well, okay. So can I just ask? Do you hold to that view of that it's only a 40-year period?
I see that more, but there's other people on here that think it's just a lot shorter than that.
No, I think it's 1,000 days. It started in 66 AD.
Wait, I'm sorry. You think it's what?
1,000 days.
Okay, that's interesting.
That started in 66 AD, and I believe we have another gentleman that would agree with that as well. We don't hold to the 40-year period.
It's almost like a reverse day principle.
Yeah. So here's
that is the principle. A day is like a year is like a day. That's what it says.
So here's what I would one objection I would give to this. This might apply partially to your view, Rob, but if we're going to say like that it began in the past, but meaning before John wrote the book, and that it only lasted either a 40-year period, or we could even apply it to just a 1,000-day period. Okay. One of the issues I would raise to that would be if we were to take the number symbolically. Okay. The justification for taking it symbolically would be, or at least in part, right, is that the Old Testament has a lot of examples, and you guys can let me know if you don't agree with this, but from what I understand, I think most people, pretty much anyone who's not a premillennialist that I've seen has always said the same basic thing about this number 1,000, is that the number itself is always used in such a way in the Old Testament to where it can actually be, more than 1,000, right? Like it's not when God says he's faithful to 1,000 generations, he's not telling us that, the 1,001st generation is out of luck, right? He's saying, as many generations as you could think of, God's faithful to all of them, right? Mm-hmm. When he says that the Lord owns the cattle on 1,000 hills, he's not just saying he only owns it, he's saying he owns all the cattle on all the hills, as many as you can count, right? Is the basic idea there. So here's the problem I have specifically with the preterist view that tries to make it less than 1,000 years, okay? And especially trying to make it only a 40-year period. The problem is, I would argue that's incongruous or out of step with the way the number is used, even in the examples that I gave. And what I mean by that is, in all of the instances where the number 1,000 is used in the Old Testament, where it can encompass more than 1,000, it's always still encompasses at least 1,000, right? So when we say that Jehovah owns all the cattle on 1,000 hills, right, that includes at least 1,000 hills or more, right? When we say he's faithful to 1,000 generations, that includes at least 1,000. Obviously it encompasses more than that.
Well.
What was that?
I said I'd have to agree with that as well.
Yeah.
The 40-year thing doesn't work.
Yeah. So the problem with trying to make it now, Rob's viewpoint is unique, and I've never encountered that before. I might have to give a little bit more thought to how I would attempt to rebut that. But at least off the top of my head, I would still say it somewhat applies, somewhat, just because of what
I would say. From my perspective, I would say that the 1,000, again, I see your point and you make a very valid point, but I just think the book of Revelation is much more symbolic of, and all the stipulations are, if we take the stipulations, the devil chained up, the kingdom of priests, ruling and reigning, resurrection.
The resurrection, though,
No, not necessarily, because you have it like those Christians that had left the old covenant, they, in a sense, died and were brought into a new. That's how I kind of see. I see the transitioning period. That's how
it says they wouldn't be resurrected till Christ came. So you would have to have Christ coming at the second coming in 30 AD.
Let me see that again.
It says they wouldn't be resurrected till he came, and so if you're saying that they were resurrected,
I think Revelation 20. I think Revelation 20 is not in chronological order, because like in Revelation 19 you have the coming of the Son of Man, you have the coming of the Lord, and then chapter 20. I think chapter 20 is going back in time.
Well, back to the second coming, not back to 30 AD.
No, because let's just go through this really quick. So,
and actually, I also have an argument I would give that chapter 20 actually is chronological, and that would also. I also used to be an amillennialist before I went to postmillennial, and I think that they actually have the same. Kind of ironically, they had the same sort of problems that I see with the preterist interpretation. But if you're interested, I could throw that out there at some point.
Yeah, I don't see the coming of Son of Man in chapter 20.
Oh, you guys are both talking at the same time.
Yeah, go ahead, Zach.
Yeah, I don't see like what you were talking about, Rob, that in chapter 20 it doesn't say Jesus came and then that's the first resurrection and then he comes again.
Well, no, we can go to Thessalonians to see the resurrection. That's when he comes.
Yeah, then you get into the one resurrection thing. That's how I would see that.
No, because it's the first resurrection.
Well, chapter Revelation 20 is the only place where you get two resurrections.
No, Thessalonians and 1 Corinthians talk about it too.
Do they?
Well, he's saying one general resurrection, I think, right?
One general resurrection.
Yeah,
no, Corinthians tells the order.
Well, it says Christ is the first fruits, and they that are his that is coming. But we're talking about the general resurrection, right? Are you of the opinion that one of the resurrections is a reference to Christ's resurrection in Revelation 20? Because I've heard a similar viewpoint to that.
I'll let Stacey. Is Stacey still with us? Maybe you could deliver that how you did it earlier, Stacey. I thought that was pretty easy.
I'm not quite sure.
I think you just hit like two verses.
Oh, yeah. It was in Revelation 20. And it just says that it's agreeing with what they're saying, that that's where you get the two resurrections from. And that is in 20, verse 5, it says, the rest of the dead did not come to life until the 1,000 years were ended. This is the first resurrection. And then the next verse it says, blessed and holy is the one who shares in the first resurrection. Over the second death has no power.
Hmm.
So if you look at Corinthians, it's saying the same thing, that those that are resurrected first are Christ. Those that Christ took under his wing. Then the Old Testament and all the dead, then they're raised after the 1,000 years, or what I would say would be 1,000 days.
Sorry, Rob. Could you explain that? I'm trying to get what you're saying.
Yeah, so Christ comes in 66 AD, before the tribulation. That's the second coming. That's when Josephus wrote that he was seen in the clouds.
Oh, so you think he returned in 66 AD? The return didn't happen in 70 AD?
Right. So he returned in 66, saves them, and then they rule with them for 1,000 days. Then comes the final judgment, and then the rest of the dead are resurrected.
Got you.
Because Josephus wrote that he was seen in the clouds in 66 and a half AD approximately, not 70 AD.
Yeah. I'm familiar with your quotation.
I'm really enjoying this, by the way. It's nice to have a
very
difference
much.
and not
great.
go at each other's throats.
Yeah. We'll start doing that in a second. Anyway, so yeah. Well, I don't know if maybe I should, because I kind of wanted to finish my point about
go for it.
Why, like, in terms of how do we know if it extends beyond that, and that was just kind of one of my points is that I would make is that because, and this is like I said too, a lot of this stuff isn't necessarily unique to the full preterist interpretation, which, like I said, I don't know if it's ironic or whatever, but I have the same kind of issue too with like placing the 1,000 years prior to the time that the book was written, because that's the same thing that the amillennialists do as well, and I used to do that, and even some post-millennialists actually do that, which I think is like kind of stupid because they're post-millennialists, not amillennialists, but and so I would just say like that would be one indication, and then I can extrapolate, I guess, like I said, like I have been, in terms of like why I don't think it works to do that, and why I think that is at least suggestive of the idea that the book was intended to communicate, more than just something that's going to happen in the first century. And then there would be other elements to it as well. Like another really important, I think, point would be in, how we're actually viewing the book as a whole, in terms of whether or not we think it's like chronological, or do we think that it's just repeating itself every 7 chapters or something, or that kind of thing as well might be worth, getting into. But
I think, thousands, definitely can mean, like you say, a lot more than 1,000. So the 1,000-year reign could be 2,000, 3,000, 4,000, 5,000, 6,000. Yeah. So, I mean, that could be.
And see, for me, too, that's another reason. Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to cut you off.
Oh, that's okay. But I guess where I get hung up is, the parts where it says, like, there would be some alive, where you talk to Caiaphas, you'll see, those type of statements.
Right. And those kinds of statements, I would say, need to be interpreted, I would say, based upon trying to use scripture to help interpret scripture, because it seems clear to me anyway, like he's alluding back to the Old Testament language, especially Daniel, when he uses that language.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's where I would say, that's why I actually brought up the point about Caiaphas and the Sanhedrin, where he tells them, you're going to see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of power. In Luke's account of that, he only has him mentioning just sitting at God's right hand. Now, my point with that was, I think what that tells us is he's not saying they're going to physically see them with their bodily eyes. Because to me, that would mean, the Sanhedrin is going to like ascend up into heaven and witness Jesus seated at God's right hand or something. And that's obviously not what he's talking about. So it must mean something different. It must mean, it must have something to do not with the second advent, but with Christ's ascension, enthronement, and his vindication as the Messiah, his exercising his kingly authority on the earth, just like Jehovah did in the Old Testament. When he's judging the nations, when he's delivering Israel, Yahweh came, he bowed the heavens, he came down riding on a cherub. It's the same idea there. And if we can recognize that, that goes into my other point, that then that does not require us in any way to concede to a preterist understanding of that, because we can make perfect sense out of those statements. We don't have to tinker around with the time statements. We don't have to do anything like that. We just recognize what the language was intended to communicate. You see what I'm saying? And I think that's another advantage personally of historicism. And this is another area where actually both of our positions do kind of overlap in some cases, because I've debated futurists before, and I use the time statements in Revelation all the time. Like, hey, things which must shortly come to pass. Like, it's very clear that that's what it means. The place where the cutoff point would be is that we don't see that as requiring that the entire book was intended to be written, or it was intended to be fulfilled in the first century. So as far, I'm kind of going in a bunch of different directions, I feel like, but in terms of like the coming on the clouds language and things like that, I think we can make perfect sense out of that. I think that we can make good sense out of that using scripture to help interpret scripture. And we don't have to conclude that Jesus returned in the first century because of that,
But then so you do take a literal interpretation somewhere though, right?
It depends on what you're asking about.
Right. Like, could you maybe hold that thought for a second? Because I was trying to throw a flag here on the play for like 20 minutes now. It's hard to jump in here. But no, I did just want to mention real quick on the 1,000 thing before we went off on to other things, right? So I did hear something. Somebody said once upon a time that I heard there's a difference in the Bible between 1,000 and 1,000. Two different things, two different words. One, 1,000 means, whatever number, like you were saying. And 1,000 means literally 1,000. There's like two different words. But then I did also want to mention, I don't know if that, if there really is any, but I just wanted to mention that. And then John, I would say, John, I think there is evidence that John wrote the book before 70 AD, because he starts off by saying, I was on the Isle of Patmos, right? The isle that is called Patmos. And he's also told later to go ahead and go measure the temple. So
right.
If he's going to measure it, to me, that just kind of seems like it has to still be there.
Can I address that? Is that okay with you guys if I address?
Yep.
Sure. So first of all, regarding the dating of Revelation, that's actually not really a huge deal from a historicist standpoint. There are a lot of historicists who actually do take an early date for Revelation. Some of them even think the destruction of Jerusalem is prophesied in chapter 6. And there's a couple different directions you can go on that. So the dating isn't really a huge issue. Some of us also even think that there might even possibly be references to 70 AD in like chapter 11, chapter 12 with the woman fleeing into the wilderness and things like that. For me personally, I tend to lean more towards a later date just because of where I place the fulfillment of chapter 6.
Okay, I just want to it has nothing. The way that you're placing it has nothing to do with what Irenaeus said, though, right?
Yeah, and that goes back to my other point. So, I don't really spend a whole lot of time on the dating, and the main reason for that is just because when you talk about the dating, you're basically talking about statements that other historical figures made and things like that, right. And that can only go so far. Which is why it doesn't really make a huge difference to me. Like, I don't really see as much benefit in trying to argue over the extra biblical, empirical data.
Right. No, I understand.
Yeah. Now that doesn't, and that's not said, by the way, to undermine preterism either. Cause like I said, even historicists have held to an early dating for Revelation. It's not like a new position or something like that. For me, it's just, it doesn't make a whole lot of difference in that regard. It's just, I don't have to, I'm not trying to like prove a later date for the book just because, like I said, that kind of evidence can always be disputed. The kind of historical statements that people made, you can always find a way to debate something, or so I don't see a whole lot of value in spending a whole lot of time on that kind of thing, in my opinion. Now, with regards though to I do think a better way of argumentation for the early date would be like what you mentioned, like the measuring of the temple. Okay, I do think that's that's how we should be debating this issue, is by the internal evidence. Here's the thing I would say about the measuring of the temple. The main issue I have with the preterist view, and again, I used to love Revelation 11 because preterists in general love Revelation 11 because that's the passage where it talks about the temple, right? And it talks about their dead bodies will lie in the great city where our Lord was crucified, right? That's like the main thing that I always used to run to when I would debate this issue. And the thing I think is overlooked when we're talking about this passage is the overall the theme of the book of Revelation. And there's a couple of different patterns and a couple of different themes in the book of Revelation. And one of the most obvious patterns in Revelation is the priesthood imagery and the temple imagery. And the temple imagery is seen all throughout the book leading up to that point, leading up to Revelation 11. Even in the very first chapter, you have the reference to how Christ has made us kings and priests, right? Even in Revelation 11, you have the kings and priests idea with borrowing from Joshua and Zerubbabel and the two witnesses and that kind of thing. So there's a lot of themes to the book, okay? And when you look at the temple in Revelation in general, it goes back to this imagery of there's a temple, this temple in heaven. This is the same idea with the souls under the altar in Revelation 6. Even in chapter 11, it identifies the temple of God that's mentioned in verse 1 as being in heaven. It says the temple of God was opened in heaven. And that's another common theme in Revelation. You've got those who are dwelling in heaven, and then you've got those who dwell on the earth, right? Those who are worshiping the beast and being deceived and all this stuff. So there's a lot of deep thematic, concepts there in this book, to where, if you're going to isolate Revelation 11 and say this is an indication that the temple was standing, once you take into account all of that other evidence just from the rest of the book and the theme of the book, in my opinion, it greatly weakens and diminishes that point, because you've got this temple is in heaven. It's a spiritual temple. The altar is a spiritual altar. The theme of those who are in heaven, like the 144,000 or the great multitude, versus those who are dwelling on the earth, who are worshiping, there's something more specific intended there, than just John's being told to measure the temple, like the physical temple that was standing in Jerusalem,
Right.
And so that I think that is a legitimate criticism of the preterist approach to that, because or their appeal to this passage. I kind of feel like we're jumping the gun if we do that, because it divorces that one verse from the rest of the book.
I thought it said that the Gentiles trample it, though. So
yeah,
I don't think that could be in heaven.
Sorry, I can hear what you said.
Hey, Armin.
Hey, what's going on?
I was just saying that it says that the Gentiles would trod it underfoot. I don't think that could be in heaven or spiritual, though, could it?
Yeah, sure. So it depends upon, like I said, how you're going to obviously, how you're going to interpret the imagery and the language and things like that. What does it mean, for the the spiritual city or the temple to be trodden underfoot? Oh, guys, wait, give me 1 second. Sorry, I gotta get the door.
But Rob, you did make a very. I was going to bring that same thing up because the chapter is literally talking about, talks about the city. I mean, I understand, what he was saying, but there's a bigger, maybe message behind it. But I mean, there's still some relevant, things here in verse 2, and then where did the two people prophesy? So it's definitely, to me, indication of the city of Jerusalem for sure. But I mean, I'm not going to say that there's not a deeper meaning behind it as well. But again, to say that has nothing to do with a physical temple on the earth. And
can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, I was just going to say, so it depends on how you're understanding the language of the city being trodden underfoot and all this other stuff. And then also how you're interpreting the 42 months and a bunch of other details.
It's just like, you can see how
else could you interpret it though?
Yeah,
maybe that's...
So, okay, hold on. So so regarding like the city and the temple and all this other stuff, and again, even in this area, we even have the holy city as being mentioned elsewhere, even in Revelation and even in the New Testament in general. Again, I try to focus a lot on patterns and themes and things like that because I feel like that's part of the way that we can help interpret, these different areas in Scripture. And you even have, like, when it comes to the holy city being trodden underfoot, even in the Gospels, you have Christ making statements about the kingdom of God or the kingdom of heaven, being taken by force, or the door being shut up to the kingdom and things like that. You've got this sort of language being used in the epistles, where, like I said, the author of Hebrews, when he talks about those who have entered into the new covenant, he says that you've come to Mount Zion, you've come to the holy, the heavenly Jerusalem, and all this other stuff. So again, it kind of goes back to that point about having to be careful not to isolate certain verses or certain terms and things. Now, in terms of how I would personally view Revelation 11, this is actually interesting because in an interesting way, it kind of does actually connect to 70 AD, although in a very different way. And this was even going to actually be my next point I was going to bring up when Zach asked about, the justification for extending its prophecies beyond that point, or beyond the first century, because I would say that the 42 months actually began in 70 AD. But I don't believe that it's talking about the 42 months because I adhere to the day-year principle. And I would say that according to, and I'm not trying to divert this to another passage or something like that, but Daniel 12:11, in my opinion, is very clear that from the time when the abomination of desolation is set up and the daily sacrifice is taken away, there will be 1,290 days, which I interpret as being literal prophetic years. So I actually think that that's another reason why Matthew 24 is a very important prophecy to understand, because that's how we know when the 1,290 days in Daniel began and in Revelation began. So being a historicist, I would say that if we're trying to interpret the imagery here of the holy city being trodden underfoot, I mean, it's not that difficult to understand that if you understand that as a reference to the kingdom of God, the people of God, the church, etc. It's the same idea as when, like I said, Christ talks about the kingdom of heaven being, suffering violence or something. It's not really a super overly complicated, imagery to interpret.
Now, what about when Luke chapter 21, where it talks about that? You take that as 70 AD as well?
Yeah, Mark 13, Luke 21. Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, do you see a correlation between the two?
Yeah. So I can understand trying to make those correlations. Here's my hesitancy with that, right? Mm-hmm. The book of Revelation is really interesting in that it kind of does that with a lot of past fulfilled prophecies. So, like, what I mean is, in Revelation, I'll give you an example. Like in Revelation 6, right? At the end of Revelation 6, at the end of the seal judgments, or wait, was it the end? It was at, the sixth seal, right? It talks about, the moon becoming blood, the sun becoming black, etc. Right?
Mm-hmm.
The stars falling to the earth. I'm sure you guys would agree that language is used of a lot of other prophecies in Scripture, right? That's not just talking about
Yes.
what happened in 70 AD. Yeah. Now, if you're talking to a futurist, okay, and I know because I've had this happen many times, they'll say things to me like, well, Tyler, Revelation 6 can't be fulfilled yet because haven't you read Isaiah 13, where Isaiah 13 clearly says the same thing, that the stars are going to fall from heaven, the sun's going to be blackened, right? And you try to explain to them, well, that's a prophecy about ancient Babylon that was already fulfilled, when Babylon was sacked by the Medes, and I have to explain the same. It's funny because I end up explaining kind of the same sort of thing. That's what Revelation actually does. Is it takes statements and language from past fulfilled prophecies, and it's applying it to this other stuff that John's seeing. He does the same thing in Revelation 11 when he talks about the two witnesses. He tells you who the two witnesses are. He says these are the two olive trees that stand before the God of the whole earth. He's quoting from Zechariah. And in the original context, I was talking about Zechariah and Zerubbabel, right? But that's not literally talking about Zechariah and Zerubbabel. It's the same thing with, what was the other one? Revelation 17, when he's talking about Babylon. He's calling it Babylon, and on top of that, he's quoting from Isaiah 13, Isaiah 14, Jeremiah 50, Jeremiah 51. And I've seen a bunch of people who have done this where they'll say, Babylon is America. And look, Jeremiah 50 talks more about Babylon, and so this again goes back. This is again why I'm super careful with this kind of argumentation, because it seems to me like this is a super common theme in Revelation. So if hypothetically, okay, let's say Revelation was written in like 96 AD. Okay, let's just say for the sake of argument, the destruction of Jerusalem is long gone now, right? It would still be perfectly in line with the rest of the book if John is using similar language here in chapter 11 as he is in like Luke 21, because he's doing that throughout the entire book. He's using the same language, but he's turning it into this symbolic apocalyptic thing. He's not referring back to these actual events as though they're yet to be fulfilled. You see the point that I'm making? So that's again why I think we have to be really careful, when we're looking at Revelation and we're saying this looks a lot like this part of Scripture, so they must be talking about the same event. Because futurists make that same mistake. They do
the main thing is
most futurists don't actually read the whole thing, I don't think.
What was that?
I said I don't think most futurists actually read the whole section which they're talking about.
I was curious.
I know who you're talking to.
I was curious on you mentioned the 1290 being like 1290 years. So, and that would be from 70 AD, I think you said. So that puts you at 1360. So, what significance does that have, and how does that work after
the traditional Protestant? The traditional historicist viewpoint is Revelation 10 through 11 is a depiction of the Protestant Reformation. So we would connect 1360 AD to the start of the ministry of Wycliffe, and then the two witnesses being symbolic of the church throughout that entire period. The two witnesses are slain in the great city by Rome, and then there's a bunch of, I don't know if you guys want me to just throw out a bunch of numbers here, but at the ninth ladder.
I'm just curious, like, how what takes us up to like our time, or is there anything even in the Bible that talks about us?
Yeah, well, so the historicist viewpoint is that Revelation is fulfilled in the same sort of way that Daniel is fulfilled, in the sense that when you go to the book of Daniel, he's talking about multiple kingdoms. He's talking about things that are going to happen over a long period of time progressively. So the historicist viewpoint is basically that Revelation began its fulfillment shortly after John wrote the book. Now, some of them think that it started in 70 AD. Some of them believe, like myself personally, that it began its fulfillment after the death of Domitian. But they believe that it spans that time period throughout history leading up to the Second Advent. So it's quite literally a middle ground between preterism and futurism.
So I've got a question.
Yeah.
Okay, so you hold to the 1260 or 1290, 1335 or whatever it might be, those being years rather than actual days.
Yeah.
Okay, so would you say then, so you said we've obviously gotten past that point then. So would you then say that the Great Tribulation has already occurred?
Yeah, that happened in 70 AD. 66 to 70. Yeah.
Okay, fair enough. The resurrection of the dead, has that occurred?
No.
Okay, so I think, okay, and I'll ask you this. What about the deliverance of the saints?
I suppose that would depend on what specific prophecy you're referring to. We have some references like in Daniel 7 and
Daniel 12.
Daniel 12.
Mm-hmm.
I mean,
so here's what I'm getting at. So there's a couple of specific events that occur or that are described in Daniel 12, right? One is the time of great distress or the great tribulation. Two is at that time your people will be delivered, everyone who shall be found written in the scroll. Those in the dust of the earth will awake, some to everlasting life, some to everlasting contempt. Mm-hmm. And it says those who are wise shall shine like the brightness of the expanse. So the main things I'm looking at is, one, the time of great distress, the deliverance, the deliverance of your people or the people, and then the resurrection of the dead. So here's one thing that I see as an issue with, one, I don't hold to 1260 being years. I definitely hold to it being actual days. But I think there's an issue with what you're saying if you don't believe the resurrection of the dead has already occurred. And here's why I say that.
Yeah.
So with that, if you look at Daniel 5, right, just start reading in Daniel 5. It says here, and then of course I'm just kind of, for sake of time, we're referencing, we just kind of read or kind of mentioned what the events were above. So it says here, then I, Daniel, looked, and behold, two others stood, one on this bank of the river, and one on the other bank of the river. And one said to the man clothed in linen, who was above the waters of the river, how long shall it be till these wonders take place? And I heard the man clothed in linen, who was above the waters of the river, when he held up his right hand and his left hand to heaven, and swore by him who lives forever, that it shall be for a time, times, and a half. And when they have made an end of shattering the power of the set-apart people, all these things shall be finished. So we've really got 2 points here, right? So the question is, when will all these things be finished? So all these things was referring to what we read in verses, or what is in verses 1 through 4. So great distress, resurrection of the dead.
He meant verse 5.
I'm sorry, verse 5, or basically what we read in verses 1 through 4 of Daniel 12. So if you look at that, if these things in Daniel 5 down is referring to those things in verses 1 through 4, so basically what you would have to have is those things having taken place before the time, times, and a half, which I'd look at that as, 3.5 years, and also the the shattering of the set-apart people, which I think is very clearly 70 AD. I mean, talking about the people being destroyed. So the problem I see with that view is, if you have those events going beyond there, then you no longer have them fitting within the same time frame as each other. You kind of, or the same time frame, or even the end event, which is the shattering of the set-apart people, which we have in verse 7.
Right.
So how would you deal with that? If you thought
there's
about
some and this kind of is a good place to mention that there's a lot of nuances, and I mean, this is really, I mean, frankly, no matter what eschatological school you look at, there's differences in interpretation, and some people prefer to start the count at a different period. My main reasoning for that, for disagreeing with, I suppose, what you would call the typical count, is the fact that Daniel 12:11 to me just seems too kind of explicit. I mean, I guess I would be interested in knowing what you think happened 3.5 years after 70 AD, if you take it to be literal.
Well, not 3.5. Well, no. So not 3.5 years from 70 AD, 3.5 years leading up to 70 AD, because
it says from the time that the daily sacrifice will be taken away and the abomination.
No. So yeah, so that's no. Check this out. Check this out, right?
Yeah.
So if you're looking at the end of Daniel 12, so let's see here. So it says, and from the time that the daily sacrifice is taken away and the abomination of the desolation is set up, there shall be 1,290 days. Blessed is he who waits and comes to the 1,335 days. But go your way until the end, for you shall rest and shall rise to receive your reward at the end of the day. Speaking of Daniel. So what he's describing here isn't starting in 70 AD. This is starting, I would say, in 66 or 67, going up to 70 AD. And here's why I say that. Because from the time of the daily sacrifice being taken away and the abomination of desolation being set up, that's the starting point. And it's taking us to 70 AD. Does that
in 70 AD when the abomination of desolation?
No. False. I would say false. Here's what I'm going to say.
Really?
Let's go to... Okay. Yeah, absolutely. So and I'm sorry, I've got very little time, but if you all are going to be on after 11, I want to try and jump back on, but let's go to Luke 21. Let's go to, where is it? Oh gosh, where is it? Where it says, okay, here we go. Luke 20. I'm sorry, Luke 21:20. So it says here, but when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then know that its desolation is near. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let those who are in the midst of her depart. Let those who are in the country not enter therein. For these are the days of vengeance to fulfill all that have been written. Okay, so think about that. And then if you look at Matthew's account says in verse Matthew 24:15 says, when therefore you see the abomination of desolation, which is spoken of through Daniel the prophet, set up in the set apart place, let the reader understand. So it's parallel passages. Luke just makes it more clear. So in Luke, he's telling us when you see Jerusalem, you being those first century believers who Yeshua was actually speaking with, when you see this, then what does he tell them to do? He tells them to flee Judea to the mountains. And historically speaking, what do we see? We see that around 66 AD, this is when I'm right.
Oh, you're kind of cutting out.
Okay.
So
can you all hear me?
Saying that from the time the abomination and desolation set up to the time the daily sacrifice was taken away was 1,260 days. It's just
no, not from the time. No, not. I wouldn't say not to the time. Those two events occurred around the same time. They actually both occurred in 66.
Yeah, that's what my point is. It says from that time. Sorry, go ahead.
Right. And so I'd agree with you there. So the thing is, though, that event occurred in 66 because basically what happened was historically, he came with the Roman legions or Roman army to Jerusalem. He surrounded the city, and that's when people actually left. That's it. That's historically documented. That's when they left. That's when the believers, the first century believers who were in Judea, would have actually fled the area and went to the mountains. So this is the time which Daniel is speaking of. So if you go back to...
That's not when it was set up, though. The abomination, that's just when they saw them standing around the city.
No. Hold on. No, but check this out. Let's look back at it. Look at Daniel 24.
Daniel what?
I'm sorry. Matthew 24:15. Okay. So these are two parallel passages.
Yeah, I know about the parallel passages. Yeah, he says when you see him standing in the holy place.
Well, no. Let's see what it says, because you said it wasn't set up, right? So it says here, when therefore you see the abomination of desolation, which was spoken of through Daniel the prophet, set up in the set apart place, let the reader understand. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let him who is in the housetop not go down to take out anything from his house. So the thing is, you have to read those. I would say you have to read those as being speaking of the same event. The two differences is this, or the difference is this. Matthew is written to a more of a Jewish audience, which would have understood the who the abomination of, or what the abomination of desolation was. And Luke was making it a little bit more apparent. But if they're talking about the same things, then the most explicit is the army surrounding Jerusalem. And so some people take the abomination of desolation being set up, having to be in the temple, like the abomination, whatever this idol, quote unquote, thing is set up in the temple.
Yeah,
but if you look at, and I agree with that. But if you look at,
and that also matches how it happened the first time when Antiochus set up the abomination of desolation.
Right. That makes sense. But the thing is, we have to look at the clear verse, which is clearly a tie-in. So you can look at the abomination of desolation as being set up in Judea or Jerusalem. In fact, I want to say Cestius.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Cestius Gallus. Right. My point is,
he went into Jerusalem, though. So.
Okay, but my point is that the way that I understand the text in the Olivet Discourse is, I don't necessarily have an issue. I'm a little bit more flexible on this just because I see a couple of different ways you could understand Matthew 24:15. But if we were to take them as parallel, which I don't really have a problem with doing, that's just saying that he saw them. They would have seen the abomination of desolation because they saw the Roman army and they saw their idolatrous ensigns. Right. Mm-hmm. I mean, they saw that, and you could also argue that I've read some commentators who have even held to that viewpoint that the city was the holy place that they were surrounding. But I still don't view that as being the same thing as them setting, because when you go back to Daniel 11 and 12, it talks about them setting up the abomination of desolation, and so I still see a distinction there.
Okay, so Daniel 12.
And Daniel.
Look at Daniel 12:11. Mm-hmm. It just says that causes desolation is set up. Isn't that the same language of Matthew 24?
But you pointed out that that's parallel to Luke's account.
Right. And so what I'm saying.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
So what I'm also saying is that, remember, Yeshua said the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet. So he's referencing back to Daniel, and this is the same. I'd say this is the same thing that we're speaking of here.
Right, but it also says that they in 11:31 they shall play. Unless you think 11:31 is talking about Antiochus, although, and again, that's probably another rabbit hole we're going to go down. But it says 31. 11:31 when it's talking about arms standing on his part, and they shall pollute the sanctuary. I believe that's talking about the Romans in 11:31, but there's some disagreement there as to where the transition takes place. But it's using the same language. It says they shall take away the daily sacrifice, and they shall place the abomination that maketh desolate. So if you're going to chapter 12, it's clearly talking about the same thing, in my opinion.
Okay, so I would disagree. I would go with that was talking about Antiochus, because if you look at the order here from verse 36, I'd say verse 36, because I think verse 36 is clearly talking about Augustus. And then if you go to verse 40, you see the Battle of Actium, and that's Rome. So I would say that was the transition. But hey, guys, I gotta get back to work.
Yeah, we'll catch up.
I gotta get back to work.
Bro. We'll see you later.
Next chapter.
Yeah, I'll try and get back on at 11 if you all are on.
Okay.
Yeah, man.
Okay. All right, man. No problem. Appreciate it.
Good talking with you.
Okay. Yeah. All right, man.
Chapter 11. I mean, that's a tough. There's so many different it could be this, it could be that.
My point of chapter 11, though, is if you think it's talking about Greece in chapter 11, I don't see why, if chapter 12, verse 11 is using the exact same phraseology, that you wouldn't think that that's talking about Greece as well. And that's one of the reasons why I personally say it's talking about Rome. And that's another reason, too, why I think it's why I hold to a historicist viewpoint, because I see it extending beyond 70 AD. Although he did bring up a fair point about the resurrection text. But I mean, I should also, I think it would be beneficial too to also even keep in mind, I mean, there are even some commentators who actually do hold to the Grecian view that Greece is actually the fourth kingdom. who have still made what?
Sorry, which verse was it that you said? 31 or?
So I referenced chapter 11, verse 31. Yeah,
Okay,
and I was just pointing out
31.
that it's saying the same thing as chapter 12, verse 11. And in chapter 11, it says that the armies, are going to set up the abomination of desolation. And he made the point that he thinks that that's talking about the Grecians, and that
No. Really, is that what he said? I think he was saying that like the armies themselves are the abomination that makes desolate.
No, that is what he was saying. But I'm saying when I pointed out that chapter 11, verse 31 says that the armies themselves will set up the abomination of desolation.
Right.
He said that he thinks 11, verse 31 is talking about Antiochus and the Grecian armies, and that it isn't until verse 30. Yeah, and I was trying to.
I don't get how what you're trying to get at as far as to who's setting up in 12, though.
Verse 30, King James actually has a note at the top, which starting at verse 30 says, "And the tyranny of the Romans." So, I mean, the way that I'm taking this, as long as this is accurate, is from verse 30 onward is to be applied to the Romans. But before that is the Grecian.
Cool. Yeah, I would agree with that. Well, I would agree. Yeah, I think that. So my understanding of this is that in verse 30, it says the ships of Kittim shall, and like Rob said, this is a very hotly disputed passage, but as far as where the thing is taking place. But I'm just going to give my viewpoint on this. I believe that the ships of Kittim shall come against him is talking about when the Roman ships came from Italy to oppose Antiochus.
Yes.
But now the question is, when you get to verse 31, who's that referring to? And I believe arms shall stand on his part. The his there is referring back to Kittim. And I would argue also that part of the reason why that is because the rest of the passage cannot apply to the Maccabean era. And there have been a lot of other commentators who have made a lot of very valid points about why that can't be talking about the Maccabees. But my point was just that when you get into chapter 12, it's using the exact same language as 1131. So if you think that 1131 is talking about time,
I mean, I don't get
why isn't 12 talking about in time? Sorry.
So 12 could be maybe not talking about the Roman army, you're thinking?
No, I think it is. I think chapter 11, verse 31 and chapter 12, verse 11 are referring to the same thing. What your friend said, I didn't get his name. I apologize.
That's all right.
But what he said was that, Albert? Okay. Yeah, what Albert said was that chapter 11, verse 31 is not talking about the Romans. And my point is, it's using literally saying the exact same thing as chapter 12, verse 11.
Yeah, I think maybe this King James version might be crazy when it says that verse on is the Romans. I don't know.
I mean,
that's a common.
I don't get how that helps prove one thing or the other. I don't
that
changes
12. Yeah, it's not.
I can explain.
It does shift events around a little.
No, because the thing is, if we stick with Daniel. If we stick with the Daniel chapter 12 and we all agree that that's Rome. Forget chapter 11 in that.
Well, no, hold on though. That's important because
I'm not saying forget it, but you would say it's Rome as well, correct?
Yeah, but I want to because Rob, I don't think is getting the point of why we got into that discussion to begin with, and I want to explain how we got to that point so you can understand like where. Yeah, because my point was. The way I understand 12:11, it says from the time, meaning beginning at the time, okay, when the daily sacrifice is taken away and the abomination of desolation is set up. I believe that's talking about 70 AD. That's when that happened. That's when the daily sacrifice was taken away. That's when the abomination of desolation was actually set up in the holy place, like Josephus records, okay? Albert was saying he thinks that happened in 66 AD. Because he tried to make the connection when you go to the Olivet Discourse, the parallel between Matthew 24:15, where when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet standing in the holy place, and Luke 21:20, he was trying to say that's only talking about the Roman army surrounding the city. My objection to that was Daniel 11:31 specifically mentions the actual army setting up the abomination. So it still has relevance to an actual idolatrous, whatever you think it was, being set up. And that's how we got into the dispute about, is 1131 even talking about Rome or not? So that's what my point was. I brought up chapter 11 to respond to his initial point.
Add a little correction, Tyler, just so you know. We have Albert here. He's still on, but Armand.
Okay.
So it's Armand that.
Okay. I'm sorry. Cool.
Yeah, I just think the main thing that with the consistency, like we would look at Matthew chapter 24 and see the great tribulation or the times of tribulation that's never ever happened and never will happen, and we see what Daniel 12:1 says, the very very similar language.
Right.
So that's how it's like the connection, and like also like Daniel chapter 2, Daniel 7, Daniel 9, Daniel 12. It seems to me that it's all talking about the same time frame, the same like when is the end of these things? Like Daniel 2, you have the kingdom being established. When yeah, but it's when you have the iron and the clay mixed together at that time, and then I take the iron as obviously Israel. Jerusalem, and at that time,
you mean Rome, and clay is
the clay is Jerusalem,
right?
Iron is the Rome,
right?
And you have this timing of at that time, the kingdom shall be established. The rock it destroys the image, right? I see that same time period as like verse 7 in chapter 12, and it's like playing out the same time period. Like it's one's not speaking about something else, and then it actually just
do you think that
we're going to go into the future, thousands and thousands of years in the future?
But don't you think that Rome is one of the images?
Of course,
I'm sorry, one of the beasts.
Yeah, of course.
Well, how do you think Christ shattered Rome?
Yeah, because if you look back in the Old Testament, Israel was always under a rulership. It got captive by Egypt, got captive by Assyria, by Babylon, Medo-Persia. Right. Okay, but now Christ's kingdom is not being ruled over by any kingdom of this world.
Okay.
That is the shattering. That is the destruction of that image, because the kingdom was taken away. The kingdom was taken away from those people, from the
But that
Jews.
happened at the ascension, though, didn't it? Because Paul says he spoiled principalities and powers at the cross.
This is where I do see this transitional period, because again we do see the old covenant still being still there in the first century, and according to Hebrews 8:13, it was near destruction. So at that time of the destruction, that is when it was complete. God gave Israel 40 more years, just like he gave them before, to kind of, you have the two Jerusalems, Galatians chapter 4, you have these Jerusalem that's in bondage. So pretty much how I see it is God gave Israel one more grace period to say, get out, because Hagar, aka the Jerusalem that's in bondage, she's about to burn. Get out and come to the heavenly Jerusalem. Yeah. And again, that's how I kind of see it. And then all the time statements, everything lines up, in my view, perfectly.
Okay. Yeah, and I'm sympathetic to some of that, like, because I can understand. To me, I do think Daniel is kind of tricky for that reason, because there's a lot of even probably more so than Revelation. I think I do think that there's a lot in, for me personally too. I know that there's a lot more stuff in Daniel that I need to kind of get more of a a hold on.
Wait a second, because you don't know everything about Daniel? Are you kidding me, dude?
Yeah, right. Yeah.
Oh my gosh, bro.
Yeah, but even, and you even throw the monkey wrench in there too, where, like I said too, there's even other people saying Rome isn't even in Daniel, which again I know we all disagree with that point, but still, there's a reason why that is, though. It's just because of the fact that there's a lot of detail in the book, and when you get down to the counting of the time periods and things like that, it can get kind of tricky and muddled with.
I mean, like the biggest thing is people always want the Bible to be about them.
Yeah, I agree with that.
They don't acknowledge.
See, I agree with that.
And I see that you do for the most part, but I mean, again, like consistently, there are still things. Like, for example, there's a passage in, you know, when we talk about near and soon and like all these things that like we will address that and say, yes, it was about to happen. 70 AD was near. It's near. Well, I mean, like the book of Revelation uses that so much. And
for sure.
like consistently, there is a passage in Numbers chapter 27 that gives a prophecy. I mean, I'm pretty sure you're aware of it. Hold on, let me see. Hold on. Chapter 24, verse 17.
Oh, right. The star out of Jacob.
Yeah, so it's just like that was 1,500 years before the coming of Yeshua.
Yeah.
So it's just like, so the Bible calls not near 1,500 years.
Yeah.
So it's not consistent with the whole. That's why I kind of feel like, with full preterism, I struggled with that for a while. But I think consistently, when I just wanted to be consistent with the whole Bible, like I see, when I do look at, I mean, again, like when we talk about, the resurrection, I think that there are certain things in eschatology that are more, I guess, not like fully aware, but like the timing, how it was supposed to be, like all these things, I think that makes things more clear. Like when we look at, what Jesus said about the coming, or his coming in the kingdom. See, that's when we get to Matthew chapter 24 and we see immediately after those days, the sun and be darkened and all these things. And then he says, the sign of the Son of Man. And then, the coming of the angels, and they will gather his elect. That's Matthew chapter 16. That's the coming of the kingdom. That's Daniel chapter 2. That's the destruction of Daniel chapter 7 and chapter 9. Because again, prophecy will be ceased. Everything is complete. The end of the 70 weeks. And what's interesting is you have Daniel chapter 12. Well, that's the destruction of the holy people. Who's the holy people? It's Israel. What's their power? Torah. When was that destroyed? 70 AD. Because again, it can't be the holy people in Daniel 12 can't be talking about the people in the Messiah, because they have no end. The church is forever and ever, because Yeshua reigns, and the body is forever. So when you look at that, okay, so the only other people that God ever called his people or holy people was Israel. It wasn't the Roman Catholic Church, because they're not around the Bible. It's not Islam. It's not anybody. It's Jerusalem. They were the holy people that God divorced. He divorced the northern house in Jeremiah chapter 3 in about 722 BC by the Assyrian army. Then you have the final divorce, the completion of the new covenant at the end of the old covenant. Again, Hebrews chapter 8:13, that the old covenant was near obsolete or near extinction. So I see all these things, and I'm like, okay, consistently, Jesus is king, and if the kingdom came at the ending of the image being strucken and destroyed, Daniel chapter 2, consistently, I have to interpret all those other passages that that some people might see as problematic. I would have to say, well, consistently, I can't go outside the Bible. Like, I can't go to the papacy, because that's hundreds of years after the book of Revelation was even written.
Yeah. Well, but that's part of the reason for that is like what you just mentioned, when people see holes or other passages that are what you call problematic, right? Mm-hmm. So kind of like the passages I've already brought up, I see those as problematic for trying to fit everything into 70 AD. And that was kind of one of my points is, I had heard of full preterism. I was pretty familiar with full preterism when I became a partial preterist. And I suppose at some point I was probably maybe sort of open to it. But when I was into partial preterism, I was running into so many problems. It was like, it kind of, from my perspective anyway, just sort of, you can't go to full preterism if you can't even get past partial preterism. You know what I mean? So it's like,
no, of course. Well, but like I said, there's problematics in every.
I wanted to ask Tyler.
Right.
Tyler, with the language that Zach had just used about near and the time statements, do you see those as being problematic for your view, or do you see those as being clear?
No. And in fact, that's part of where the overlap actually is with preterism and historicism. I use like a very similar argument that Zach just used when he talked about Numbers 24:17. I use a very similar argument against futurists, but I just use Daniel chapter 8, where Daniel has a vision of the temple service being restored.
I don't get how historicism is different than futurists.
Well, it's different because, like I said, it's really more so of just a middle ground between preterism and futurism. So we don't say, instead of trying to fit everything into the first century, and instead of trying to fit everything into the future, we say it's fulfilled progressively. It began in the past, and it's
continually going on compared to where partial preterist is first century, and then future, and then futures is just
we would say that's similar to, like I said, if you compare like Revelation to Daniel, how is Daniel, how are its prophecies fulfilled? It was progressively, right? He's having a bunch of different visions about different kingdoms, different kings, different rulers who are going to rise up and things like that. Do
you believe like prophecy can still happen then today then, or?
Technically, yeah, because I don't believe the Book of Revelation has been fulfilled yet. But not.
No, I mean like a new prophecy. Like, can a prophet like tell the future?
Oh, no, I wouldn't say so. I mean that also I kind of feel like goes into like the debate on like cessationism or something. But personally, no, I don't hold to that viewpoint.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
One of you looked at that verse. What does it say? If a prophet speaks a prophecy and it doesn't come to pass, like, do not fear that prophet. So maybe like, do not fear that prophet. What do you think about that verse where it says like, because I always thought like, you're going to give me a prophecy and it's going to be for like 500 years from now, like you better give me little markers along the way so I can mark it off and be like, all right, that did happen. All right, next part. All right, that did happen. Yeah. But if somebody gives you a prophecy and it's like not supposed to happen until like 2000, whatever, I'm just
all right.
Like, how are you supposed to even like use that as like, it's like, all right, well, I can't even. I'm not even gonna be here.
Right.
So
yeah, like I said, that's another point of agreement in a lot of ways too. Like I said, I mean, I would agree with that because I mean, I think that we can definitely I do think like the Book of Revelation began its fulfillment like right after John wrote the book. Like I hold to it. Like I said, I tend to favor a later date for Revelation, but I do think that it happened. It started being fulfilled right after the death of Domitian, and it's continued its fulfillment. So, and I use that same method of argument.
Just a quick question.
It's very interesting because Rob used to put it toward Domitian as well.
Yeah. What king do you have Domitian as in like the number? Like 10th, 11th, 12th, or do you know?
Are you saying like the horns on the beast?
Yeah, like you have him in that order somewhere?
I don't count. Okay, so I don't believe that any of the Caesars or any of the emperors are horn. And this is actually another issue I had with preterism. I've gone in a bunch of different directions on like which king is which horn on the beast. And it was, in my opinion, I think that there's just a ton of problems with trying to fit the Caesars onto the 10 horns. And so I go with the position that the 10 horns are actually kingdoms as a whole. In this, just as in prophecy, especially in Daniel, a king can be mentioned and it's representative of the actual kingdom as a whole. Kind of like in Daniel 8, it talks about that. It talks about
I do know
Persia.
I do know that they were hiring people. Like the Romans towards the end there, they were hiring mercenaries left and right. So like there was a bunch of people working for them that weren't them.
Yeah, well, and what I mean, I just think that there's a lot of I remember dealing with that problem when I was a preterist, trying to interpret Revelation 17, and I was looking up like these different lists of like Caesars and stuff, trying to say like where's Nero on
that was on earlier. He kind of showed me that and us as well that they are kingdoms as well, but the kings actually go back more to Daniel than Revelation, where we would
and that's part of the confusion.
The horns are actually kingdoms as well.
Yeah, so I would say personally, I think that the 10 horns are the 10 nations that came after the Roman Empire fell. Like I said, I take them to be actual dominions or kingdoms as a whole.
And that would be after or like way later.
No, yeah, that would be after the Roman Empire fell. So that would be like in like the 4th, 5th century.
Fair enough.
Yeah. Regarding after Domitian, what I mean by that is, and this is probably, and like I said, some of the views I'm espousing here, like my views on like the 1290 years and all this stuff, isn't like monolithic. Like I said, there's distinctions in all eschatological schools. So some historicists, like I said, would say that like Revelation 6 is talking about like the destruction of Jerusalem. For me, I see it more as focusing entirely on Rome. And so I would say that when it comes to like the first 6 seals, you do have a fairly consistent fulfillment of the seals in the history of the empire after the death of Domitian. So I would begin the fulfillment at around maybe 98 AD with the Nerva Antonine dynasty. And then from there, the way that we understand like the different symbols and things is, generally speaking, it would be chronological. There's still room for recapitulation, but we would say like the seals, for instance, the first horseman, the second horseman, etc., are chronological events in history.
So I'm not actually sure I was here. If you did you guys go over the first verse of Revelation, or did I miss that?
I think we commented on it a little bit. We kind of did because Zach asked me what the justification was for not thinking that everything in Revelation was fulfilled by the 1st century. Okay. And that was kind of when I brought up, I don't know if you were here. Were you here when we talked about the 1,000 years in Revelation 20?
Yeah, I think so. Okay,
yeah, that was kind of the direction that went in, where I was just saying that even if we just took a step back and just kind of looked at Revelation, we have like this mention of 1,000 years, in chapter 20. But in regards to like chapter or verse 1,
right. Well, okay. So we do have the 1,000 years, right? I was definitely here for that. But it does say in the beginning right here, though, right? It says, the revelation of Jesus Christ, which God gave unto him to show his servants things which must, I'm sure he understands, shortly, right?
Right. Yeah, and that's where I said that I agree. And like I said, I used the same argument against futurists. So we were in agreement there. The only difference is we look at the book, though, and we say, well, things which must shortly come to pass doesn't mean everything in the book had to be fulfilled.
Okay, so you're going to say things which must shortly come to pass, but also some other stuff for later.
Well, because it was inclusive. We basically view it as saying that it was going to begin its fulfillment shortly. Because, like I said, if we look at the book, I mean, we have, well, first of all, we have a couple of different references, like in chapter 6, chapter 8 and 9, to the apocalyptic imagery that we talked about earlier about like stars falling from heaven, the sun and moon being dark, which signifies the fall of a city or a kingdom.
Totally.
So we've got a couple of references to that in Revelation. Secondly, we have, this isn't like the only other point, but, like I mentioned again, when we look at the book, we see like this other reference to 1,000-year period. So that's at least somewhat indicative of moving beyond the 1st century. So we look at different things like that and we see, well, we don't have to really view it that way. It's not really necessary, So what chapter 1, verse 1 and verse 3 do tell us is that the events did have relevance to the 1st or 2nd century, depending on, like I said, the dating of Revelation. And it was definitely going to at least begin its fulfillment shortly after, he wrote it. But that doesn't mean everything, had to be fulfilled within like a couple of years or something.
And then, so just before I'll shut my mouth for a while, but what about verse 11? What about verse 11, where it says, just write it to these 7 churches, just those guys?
Yeah.
7 are these church ages, or are those the actual?
So I'm actually personally, I'm open to the church age idea. I think it sounds kind of neat, but I don't really hold to like a real hard position on that. I kind of have to look into more. I kind of have to look into that more, to be honest. I've kind of avoided that for a while, just because I kind of, when I started really digging into Revelation, and I had already dismissed it when I was a preterist, and then when I got into historicism, I was kind of like, I'm not really going to touch that. I'm just going to focus on, the rest of the book.
Hey, have you ever heard of this argument?
Oh yeah.
I guess I listened to this one video that because honestly, well, if we step back and we, if you are correct on the dating, we're just wrong.
Sure.
So
Yeah.
there was this video that I watched, and it was this pastor, some Baptist pastor or whatever, and he was saying that how preterists are. Or I don't think he mentioned preterists, about the early date of Revelation. He said in chapter 2, this is the congregation in Ephesus.
Yeah.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
So he says in verse 4, he says, "Nevertheless, I have something against you because you left your first love."
Mm-hmm.
Right? And so I guess for the most part, early dating of Revelation could be, let's just say, like, I don't know, what if you had to say an early date of Revelation, what would you say, like 66 or like 63,
like
64? Okay, let's just say that, right? When was the book of Ephesians written?
I don't know. I mean, I've read A.T. Robinson's book where he actually argues that all the New Testament books were written prior to 70 AD, but I don't, like I said, I don't really,
that view, of course.
Yeah, I don't. I do think we can kind of tell with certain books, like the book of Hebrews. I definitely think. Also, I would even say some of the other books, like James or Peter, where we actually have other time statements, right? Like the Lord is at hand or something like that. To me, those time statements, I think it's really interesting that the time statements like that, like those ones are in books where you've got a Jewish or an Israelite audience.
Mm-hmm.
That's something that I noticed very early on, because to me, those time statements make plenty of sense that that's talking about the destruction of Jerusalem, So I think that we can kind of tell from those passages or those books.
Yeah, so let's just forget the book of
after.
Ephesians, right? What's interesting is in the book of Acts chapter 20.
Mm-hmm.
Right, so if we go to Acts 20, starting in verse 17.
Okay.
So pretty much the main argument that this guy, before I just start reading this stuff, the main argument that this guy was saying was, it doesn't make sense that if this book was written in such an early date, that the congregation in Ephesus had fallen away so quickly.
Mm.
But if you give it to 90-something AD, now you're giving, 40 years for the church to fall away. You're giving, It could be 50 years. I don't, especially the book of Acts chapter 20. I don't know when the exact timing of that was, where the date, you know where that one is?
The dating in Acts 20?
Yeah.
Like when the events took place? I'm not sure.
Okay, well, but so what's interesting here is I don't want to I'm trying to make my point, I guess. But
okay.
So verse 17, it says, "And sending to Ephesus from Metellus, he called the elders of the congregation." Right? So this is obviously to the Ephesians, to the church in Ephesus. And I'm just going to skip. It's not really the main thing is, I'm going to just start now in verse 20. I just wanted to show you that this was to Ephesus. 28 says, "Then take heed to yourselves and to all the flock, in which the Holy Spirit placed you as overseers to shepherd the congregation of God, which he purchased through his own blood. For I know this, that after my departure, grievous wolves will come in among you, not sparing the flock. And out of you yourselves will rise up men spreading perverted things in order to draw away the disciples after themselves."
Mm-hmm.
So the argument was that this guy was saying that, like I said, you have 40-something years for the congregation to fall away from their first love.
Sure.
Right? So I just didn't know if you were aware of that argument. But how I see this, well, I guess I don't know if you could see this then, in this passage here, if the book of Acts chapter 20, this time period was obviously before the book of Revelation was written, but Paul is saying to these overseers, to these, these people that are going to be in charge, you could say, that they were the ones that right when Paul would leave, then wolves would come among you, not sparing the flock. And now think about this. If these overseers were literal elders, and, if you look at the words, it's an elderly person. These are grown-ups, you could say, They could be in their, I don't know how old, maybe like 60. I don't know.
Okay.
Could be a little bit older, whatever. It would make more sense that the falling away would happen in their lifetime from when they were overseeing versus plus 50 years in the future when they were like 100.
Sure.
So I guess that gives it more credence to the book of Revelation that, well, look, the falling away of Ephesus, it did happen very shortly, like Paul said in Acts chapter 20.
Yeah.
So instead of a 50, 40, 50, maybe 60-year period of the falling away, because if it, because some, who knows, maybe Acts chapter 20 was written in, or that time period, I should say.
Here's another thought along those same lines. And I don't know, this isn't really necessarily like an argument against what you're saying, but just another interesting fact to take into account. Paul does mention when he was about to be put to death in 2 Timothy. And from what I understand, most commentators have said that he was put to death under Nero. And so that also is kind of just an interesting little thing in terms of like a time frame to give, I mean, that could have also been.
Who was put to death?
Oh, Paul.
Oh, Paul. Okay.
Yeah. So, and like I said, that's not really an argument for or against what you're saying. It's just kind of another interesting thing about the timing of when he possibly could have died. That could have been around, 66 AD or however long.
Yeah.
But like I said, the thing, timing and dating and stuff like that, the reason why I don't spend a lot of time on it is just because a lot of it seems just really speculative to me, so it's just kind of.
Yeah, I just think like what I would say is the consistency from my perspective of, obviously not just a revelation being fulfilled in the first century, because it would have to be fulfilled before 70 AD in the sense at 70 AD and things like that, like definitely before that. So consistently, when I see this generation in Matthew chapter 24, I see it consistently with the same thing: the coming of the kingdom, the coming of the parousia, coming of the Lord.
Yeah.
You have the judge standing at the door. James says, like he was ready, and Romans 16 that they were Satan was about to be, bruised under your feet. Like this stuff, like has to have a contextual, audience relevance. Like it just can't be arbitrary just saying all this stuff and just like, oh well, you know what, it's actually going to be fulfilled 100 times over, and it's just gonna we spiritualize this stuff, but then this is literal. But
and I guess
of course
for me,
it's literal. I mean, in my perspective, things are literal. Like Stacy on the panel can actually go through Revelation 9. It's really interesting when you talk about the pit opening up and the scorpions and all these things. Like there's some like historical evidence that this was the Roman army that came against Jerusalem.
It was their weaponry.
The Scorpio weapon. It was a giant like archery like spear. It's pretty deep stuff. And literally you can Google all these things.
Sure.
One of the legions that was sent to Rome was called Apollinaris or something like that, which is, like the name Apollyon. And it's just like all this stuff. Like, so we can have like an actual physical historical, like, go back in time and say, look, this did take place. It's just not in the manner that, the Left Behind movie's showing you. It's not it's to the whole world. It's to the I guess the Roman army, the Roman area there, that world. That was the I think the word like proskuneo.
So do you think? Like that. I got a question. I'm just curious. So do you think that like some of the prophecy, like when you see scriptures or not scriptures, but statements in Revelation about like things happening on the earth or like the land or whatever.
Yeah.
Do you think
land?
Yeah. Huh?
So I'm sorry, I interrupted you. I'm sorry. You.
That's okay. Okay. Yeah. Do you think that there are some like events in Revelation that actually took place in the province of Rome in general, or do you think it's like all just in taking place in Jerusalem?
I mean, I know that there are certain things. The guy that was on here before that brought up Daniel 12 and Daniel, all that kind of stuff, and Luke 21. He has some interesting things about. There were other things going on at the same time during and through the Roman, world. But I would say, for the most part, to a Jewish believer, to a Jewish audience that would be hearing this, or somebody that's learning and things like that, when you hear the word land, well, what do you think? Just like when you hear coming on the clouds or all these things, what do you think? We in 21st century, we have our own thoughts we think
of like the entire planet.
Exactly, the whole globe, but not realizing.
And I'm not saying that is what it's like what that word means. I'm just trying to get an idea, because that's also a really important point as well. Like I believe it was Albert, right, who brought up the 7 churches.
I think so. Yeah.
And there's a lot of really interesting statements that Christ makes to the 7 churches as well that are in Asia. And from I can see it making a lot of sense, from the historicist viewpoint, if we're kind of expanding the scenery, if you will, of the fulfillment out to Rome in general, like the actual Roman province, because we even do have historical, information about persecution that the Asian or now it would be like in Turkey, right? The province, the congregations in Asia went through under the various Roman emperors, especially Domitian. So I mean, I kind of find that interesting as well, and that's also part of why I guess I was just wondering, like, do you think some of the specific prophecies in Revelation actually were about things happening elsewhere besides just Jerusalem, or do you think it was all intended to be in Jerusalem or Judea?
I mean, because I think that there, because according, I take Matthew chapter 23, 24.
Hey, Amanda, I agree with you about that comment, by the way.
And so cool. So, but you have also Matthew chapter 23 that talks about from Abel to you have all this blood being judged on them, but it's more than just it is the judgment. It is the wrath, you could say. So I definitely, it wasn't in a sense specifically only just like literally Jerusalem. There's places outside of Jerusalem that was getting certain things, and you can like my friend Armand, he went and started talking about like where 100,000 people dead, like lots of people dead.
Yeah.
But
like there were going to be like wars and rumors of wars too and stuff, right? So like Christ predicted, and that was happening in a bunch of different areas around.
You got to think about something though. This is an important part of like how I like to write. What is the Pax Romana? That's the peace of Rome, right? Like, how are you going to give me a warning? Like, you'll hear of wars and rumors of wars. Like, dude, there's always wars, but not during the peace of Rome.
Yeah, I actually think that the Pax Romana is part of the Six Seals, actually. So, interestingly enough.
Yeah, I take the recapitulation of the of Revelation. So it's pretty much all the same thing over and over again. 70 AD, 70 AD, 70 AD.
So hey, Albert, or were you the one who just said that you agree with that?
With what?
With the Pax Romana being in Revelation?
Well, I said the Pax Romana, and then I mean, I guess I could agree with that. I mean, it's definitely part of it. I mean,
like do you think it's prophesied, or do you also think like everything's only confined to Jerusalem?
No. I mean, it could go outside. I mean, it's the whole kingdom, but it's like the Pax. You can't tell me like watch out for this if it's happening all the time. Like watch out for wars.
Sure.
Like, dude, there's always wars. Like.
Right, yeah. Well, and see, that's and again, that's another. Yeah, I would agree with that. That's another reason why I think the futurist view is very murky.
But if you had a specific time where it was like known, it was like the peacetime, and like, how dare you disrupt the peace of Rome? Like, oh,
yeah.
You know,
well, I
you're going to get crushed
in the White Horse in Revelation 6:2 with the Nerva-Antonine dynasty. That's another reason why I think it was fulfilled directly after Domitian died, because after Domitian died, you had one of the most prosperous periods in Roman history, and directly after that, you have the after the death of who was it? Caracalla, I think it was, started the civil war in the Roman Empire, just like the Second Horseman depicts.
I think Domitian was kind of like the top of it. Like he was the top of the empire. After that, it kind of went down the hill. After that,
after Domitian, no. During the Nerva-Antonine dynasty, which took place right after the death of Domitian, you had the most prosperous period in the Roman Empire. Now, after that, you're right; it did begin to go downhill.
Right. Yeah. Okay. So I was just slightly off, but me and Rob were always willing to give a little leeway and go as far as Domitian, maybe even a little farther. We just didn't ever get that far. You know, like we never had enough.
Still has to be fulfilled. Right. So like it could be expand, but not right.
Well, no, Rob was in it too. Like we were both playing with the fact that it might go to Domitian. Like Domitian might be a player here, but there's also the fact that a lot of these guys actually had Domitianus or Domitian in their name.
Oh, right.
Nero and all of them almost.
That's another reason why his name is so vague. Actually,
what's that?
That's another reason why Irenaeus' quote about Domitian, quote unquote, like we don't know which one he was referring to.
That's why I was clarifying. Plus, Irenaeus was also way after the fact. Like, look at when he lived. Yeah, thank you.
Exactly.
From him. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Right. Right.
It's like, dude, you weren't even there. You were like 2 years old. There's no way you could have talked to the guy.
Right. That's a very good point, yeah.
What I find peculiar about Revelation is that if it was written after 70 AD, there is no.
Wait, I'm sorry, Stacey. You're kind of cutting out for me.
I'm sorry. What I find interesting about Revelation is that if it's written after 70 AD, there is no mention of the destruction of the temple, and that would be vindicated.
You're still cutting out, man. Wait, is he? Am I the only one who's hearing him cut out?
Yeah, it's kind of really bad, Stacey. But I kind of said I know what he's saying. He's saying about that if it's not about 70 AD, that there, I guess there's no mention of the destruction of the temple anywhere in the Bible.
Well, no, it's mentioned in Matthew 24.
But it's not. I mean, that it happened. Like, why wouldn't
if Revelation was written after the destruction of the temple, and the temple so profound in the Jewish mindset, and it would have been such a vindicating statement that the temple had been destroyed, that Revelation should somewhat mention it. It wouldn't have to, but it is peculiar that it doesn't mention the destruction of the temple.
Well, I think the problem I would have with that argument is it's kind of more of like an argument from silence in a way. It seems kind of like, I don't know. It's not really based on like a positive kind of,
not anything to hang your hat on, but when you have to play detective and you've got silent arguments from men.
Yeah. Yeah, well, and I would say too that kind of goes into it all eventually sort of, like I said, like I mentioned at the beginning, kind of does revolve around the overall how do I put it, framework, I suppose, that you're approaching it from. And so the different pieces of the puzzle that you're bringing together, to put things together, you know what I mean? Like the way that you're structuring things. And so I think that from the historicist standpoint, the way that we kind of view it, and this is like what I mentioned earlier when we were talking about Daniel 12, is 70 AD was more of a beginning, rather than just when everything was finished. It was the beginning of something. And our point, and again, this is probably where we would have some overlap with the preterist standpoint, but we would affirm, Christ is king now. He's seated at God's right hand, and we see this other motif in Scripture that the Messiah is seated at God's right hand until all of his enemies are placed under his feet. And so we would just say that 70 AD, apostate Jerusalem, that was the first enemy Christ. Well, maybe not the first, depending on technicality, but that was he began with Jerusalem in 70 AD. He put apostate Jerusalem under his feet. And when we get into the book of Revelation, we have this grand picture now where it's not just Jerusalem. He's putting others under his feet. He's putting Rome under his feet. He's putting he's raising up and putting down his enemies throughout, like I said, progressively, and this is also where this is another reason too why historicists typically have a much more optimistic, eschatology than a lot of futurists typically do.
What I'm wanting to ask you all night is that where in Revelation are we at right now? Where would be your cutoff point?
Sorry, man, you're still kind of cutting out.
I'll type it.
Yeah, maybe just try. Can you not just talk like closer, or do you already try that?
I'm talking like really close, but
I can hear you better now a little bit.
As far as Revelation is, where is your cutoff point for place in the past versus what's happening now? Where would you put that time frame?
Oh, so you're saying where do I think we are right now, like on the prophetic scale?
Yeah.
So, okay, yeah. So I'm still kind of open on the question, just like with everything else, but I'm following, for me personally, I follow a very much so kind of more traditional sort of Protestant historicist kind of view of the fulfillment of the different prophecies. So I would say we're probably waiting for the 6th and 7th vial to be poured out, personally. I could be wrong about that. I could, I'm always studying, but if I'm following the more traditional route that most historicist commentators have gone, that's where I think that we are so far. That we're, because everything else to me seems to make perfect sense in terms of, how everything else has been fulfilled. So I would say Revelation 16 in terms of chapters,
Do you believe in like a physical kingdom, like an earthly cosmos? The cosmos here,
well, I believe that. I mean, I believe that we're going to spend eternity on Earth, but I don't. I'm not I don't have like a premillennialist understanding, if that's what you're asking me, where like the kingdom hasn't come yet or something like that.
You talk about this Earth, like where we are right now, like right here.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. Why not?
But what do you do with so would you say, like in my interpretation, when I see Matthew chapter 24, I correlate that with the coming of the kingdom, because I mean it's the coming of the kingdom. Do you see that as Daniel chapter 2 as well?
Well, I would say, it goes back to that issue. It goes back to the interpretive question of what do you mean by coming of the kingdom? Because Christ, told the Pharisees when he was casting out demons that the kingdom of God had come upon them. He says he's telling the people the kingdom of heaven is at hand. At the beginning of ministry.
The reason why, because like if I go to Hebrews, right?
Yeah.
Hebrews chapter 9 correlates. Starts talking about the tabernacle, the temple, starts showing you the things that were behind the veil and all these things, right? Yeah. But it says in verse 9, it says, and it was a parable for this time, during which oblations and sacrifices were offered, that could not make perfect the conscience of him who offered them, but only in food and in drink and various washings and fleshly ordinance until the time of reformation has been imposed. So my thing here is how I see this, and then it correlates with Matthew chapter 24, that temple, that was the parable, that was the symbolization of the world, or of that heaven and earth. So first, that earth, or that representation of that time or that age, need to be destroyed to bring in completely the consummation of the new.
I hear what you're saying.
So when I see Matthew chapter 24, the reason it starts off with, look at the temple. Look how amazing it is, because it says, and going out, Yeshua left the sanctuary, and his disciples, this is verse 1, came to show him the construction of the sanctuary. So it starts off, the disciples start this off with showing Yeshua the actual representation of that time period, aka the temple. So Jesus said, and then this is why the question is, when will all these things be? What is the sign of your coming in the end of the age? They composite that with the temple. Why? Again, Hebrews chapter 9. It is the parable. It is the symbol of that age or that time period.
Sure. Okay.
So when I read that, and I see Matthew chapter 24, and then boom, here's the sign of the Son of Man, the angels coming in power and much glory. This is
it was
again
Christ, his footprint on things, so to speak, right? Like he's actually solidifying his kingship and things like that, right? Is that what you're saying?
Because it's the destruction of the old covenant. Because remember, the old covenant was still there. That parable was still there. Just like it says in Hebrews chapter 8 that Jesus would not be a priest on earth, seeing that there are already priests offering gifts according to the law.
Right.
The law, a lot of Christians or believers might say that the law ended at the cross, but it ended in a sense. But a complete destruction was at 70 AD.
Okay,
so law, and I correlate that also with Daniel chapter 12 verse 7.
Yeah, I don't really have an issue with most of what you're saying. I mean, I forgot what your original question was. Actually,
I guess with the kingdom. So, like, how my whole point here is that how I'm reading this and trying to be consistent is possible. Seeing what Jesus said about the coming of the kingdom, seeing what whoever wrote the book of Hebrews said about what the temple was a shadow of, and seeing what Daniel says, and I'll just go to Daniel 2 really quick just to read that, two verses in verse 2, or in chapter 2. And it says, and in the days of these kings, the God of heaven shall set up a kingdom which shall never be destroyed, and the kingdom shall not be left to other people. It shall crush in pieces and make an end of all these kingdoms, and it shall stand forever. Because you saw the stone which was cut out of the mountain without any hands, and it broke the iron. And so, again, it destroys the rulership of God's people. No longer is God's people going to be ruled by these earthly rulers. It is now completely destroyed.
See, I guess that's another area where I want some clarity. I don't want to obfuscate your question, though. But I am interested in where you think, like in that statement when he says he's going to make an end to these kingdoms.
Yeah, no more of them ruling over them.
Well, Babylon is destroyed; it's gone. Greece was. I know there's a Greece now, but
right.
Looking at the history of Greece, you'll see that it wasn't for a while there. I think.
Right. Yeah.
And then, so it came back, but Rome is no more. There's a city, sure, but it's not called Rome anymore. So they all are.
Well, they would say it's the Catholic Church.
We're talking here. Well, no, hold on though. We're talking in the context of prophetic interpretation here.
Right, and so that they were. It was the Babylon, Persia. They're all gone. They were all those kingdoms were destroyed when he comes. Now they're all his kingdom. So there is no Persia. There is no Babylon. There is no. They're all his now.
So I can see what you're saying. Like, when you think about 70 AD, well, Rome was still in power. They get destroyed. Like, they were still there well after 70 AD. But my interpretation is these kingdoms ruled over God's people. No longer is God's people being ruled by a specific nation like it was during the Old Covenant.
Well, the Christians were still being persecuted by the Romans, well after 70 AD, though, weren't they? Like, in that sense, in the sense of being...
The thing is we have to really understand in a sense that, then there's interpretation of, were the believers caught up? Were some of them still left here?
Yeah.
I believe that majority fled. They definitely they were saved for sure. They didn't experience any of those things. So again, consistently what I see here is this is the kingdom being established. Like, I understand,
I can agree with that.
So for me, I just see it all consistency, and that's how I'm interpreting Matthew chapter 24. So when you see Matthew 24,
Yeah. Well, to answer your question, I guess I don't have really much of a problem with most of what you said. In fact, I would even say historically, a lot of the points that preterists bring up are not really entirely new points. just in terms of, looking at like traditional Protestant commentaries and things like that on different passages like Matthew 24, like Revelation. When it comes to what I think about the coming in the kingdom language, I don't really have an issue, like I said, with it saying that it was like, sort of a solidifying of Christ's kingship or something along those lines. I would still understand the coming of the kingdom or the coming of the Son of Man there to be, like I said, just another reference to just hearkening back to the apocalyptic judgment language of the Old Testament. The kingdom of God came upon Jerusalem, in 70 AD, just like the kingdom of God was coming upon the Pharisees when they witnessed Christ casting out demons. Now, obviously, there was different significance to both of those instances, but it's still essentially the same idea in terms of what the language is signifying. You know what I mean? And so from the historicist standpoint, like I said, we would agree with the idea of, the solidifying of the kingdom, but that's just the beginning in terms of the prophetic timeline for us. It's not the end of the prophetic timeline. That's the beginning where Christ is beginning to put his enemies under his feet as Lord, as one who's been given power in heaven and on earth, so that is probably, I guess, more of a key distinction there than between how we're viewing it in terms of what happens after that, what takes place after the kingdom comes and, Christ is enthroned in heaven and all this other stuff. So,
yeah, no, I would agree 100% that the kingdom, that's why I see like this transitioning period where the believers that came into Christ, that, heard the gospel, they were regenerated by the Holy Spirit. God opened their eyes and they came into faith by a gift of God.
Hey guys, I'll be right back.
Yeah, bro.
Okay.
That those people, like, in a sense, left Jerusalem, like, especially because, again, we know for the most part in the beginning of the church era, they, when, in Acts, it was just mostly Jewish people coming to the faith, that those people left Hagar, Galatians 4. They left that city in bondage, and they came to the New Jerusalem, like the greater Exodus. Like a lot of Hebrew roots talk about the greater Exodus. I believe completely fulfilled. And this is that transitional period. They were leaving. The Exodus was happening. Yeshua, according to Luke chapter 9, he fulfilled the Exodus, the way out, by his death. And again, it's all these prophecies coming to fruition that was prophesied through Abraham, that they would all the nations would be blessed. Because again, then when the message went to the Gentiles, they left their paganism and came into the new covenant. But again, the old covenant was still there. It just
because the temple system was still
exactly. So this is why I see this 40-year period that it's kind of like this is why people can see. I don't know. I know John was like Hebrew roots and stuff. I'm pretty sure you might be a little bit as well.
I mean, I'm Sabbatarian. I keep the dietary laws and all that other stuff, but I don't like the Hebrew roots movement either. So
so I can see the reasoning behind where people can understand the Hebrew roots, because a lot of Christians would say, like I said before, that the law ended at the cross. But then you read the book of Acts and you're like, oh well, they're keeping Shabbat, they're keeping Shavuot, they're keeping Yom Kippur. So you're like, well, wait a second, this is not done away with. Paul says, I've never eaten anything unclean or common. So you're just very confused. But the problem is,
the old covenant age hadn't ended yet.
Exactly.
Right.
At the end of so at 70 AD, I believe that the law completely 100% is just done away with, gone.
Gotcha. Yeah.
That and for me, that is Daniel chapter 7. Daniel 12 verse 7 says, the power of the holy people. At that time, the power of the holy people will be completely shattered. And then that's how I'm correlating with 70 AD, the temple, Jesus, the disciples questioning when they questioned Jesus and asked him, when will the parousia, when will your coming or your presence be, that they were looking forward to. And then you have
just to make a note about that, by the way, in Matthew 24, This is another problem too that I don't think preterists necessarily make this same assumption, but I think that this is a flawed assumption a lot of futurists make as well. When they see the disciples asking that question, what will be the sign of thy coming? We have to keep in mind at that point that the disciples didn't even understand at that point that Messiah had to die and be raised from the dead. And so I also think that that's kind of another point that a lot of people, when they see, when you tell most people, or when I do anyway, because like I said, I'm not a full preterist, but when I will tell someone that, Matthew 24 has been fulfilled, among the objections is, well, wait a minute though. They asked him when his second coming was going to happen. So are you saying the second coming is already happened? But the problem is that the disciples weren't expecting a second coming because they weren't even expecting Christ to die yet. They didn't understand that he had to die for their sins and be raised from the dead. It wasn't until after his resurrection they had opened their eyes and explained out of the law, the prophets, and the Psalms, right? So I just think that's another little important contextual point that is often overlooked when people say, well, they're asking about the second coming. Well, I don't think that they were, because they didn't understand yet that they weren't even expecting.
And I will agree on that as well too. Of course, they didn't truly understand. Even in Acts chapter 1, they said, "Well, then is now the time?
Right, exactly,
going to be restored." And it wasn't for that time right then and there.
Yeah.
But the biggest thing is like you also have, like I take, this verse in Matthew chapter 16, it says, "For it is necessary for the Son of Man to come in the glory of his Father, and then with his holy angels, and he will reward each man according to his works." Truly,
See, and when did that happen though, too? I think it's important to ask.
When did this happen? Like when Matthew 16 took place, or when did the
that back to what I was talking about earlier, where when you see the language of the Son of Man coming in his glory, or the Son of Man coming in the clouds.
Yeah,
there's an assumption there with that futurists make, and I think there's going to be some variation amongst preterists how they view it from my experience, but I think the assumption there is that this has to be language talking about the second advent, that they're equated to one another. And I don't
take it as the ascension, right?
I would say the ascension,
gotcha.
And also, but I think there's flexibility there. Like I think that it has reference to the ascension, but it's more than that. It's Christ's exercising his dominion, just like how Yahweh exercised his dominion in the Old Testament, and they called that Yahweh came to us riding on a cloud. It's like,
but not the rewarding though. Not so again. Like I look at Daniel chapter 12 again, and it says that he will. Let me go there really quick, because the passage does say, "And he will reward each man according to his works." So this is the and it says in verse 1, it says, "At that time Michael shall stand up, and the great ruler who stands for the son of your people, and there shall be a distress such as never been before the nation until now. And at that time your people shall be delivered. Everyone shall be found written in the book." So it's kind of like that reward that, again, like I read this here, and he will reward each man according to his work. This is also Matthew chapter 24. It's the same language.
This kind of goes into another related issue here. So, like, even with that, and this I think just shows part of the, I don't want to say difficulty, but I guess why it's somewhat tricky when you're interpreting these different passages, because like if we go back to Daniel 12, right?
Mm-hmm.
Everyone found written in the book. Now when I read that, okay, so Daniel 12, I don't have a problem saying that's 7 AD. I know that I have issues with, obviously we got to address like the resurrection and all that other stuff, but just focusing on verse 1, right? I see that as referring to the ones who survived, the ones who fled into the wilderness, most likely. Do you think that, like, how do you understand the reference to like everyone whose name is found written in the book? Like, do you think that that's an exhaustive, thing, or do you think that's just another way of saying everyone who's meant to survive that calamitous, period?
Yeah, of course it's not talking about us.
No, not just us, but I mean, like, when it talks about everyone being found written in the book. Like,
the believers. I would say like the book of life, you could say like the believers, they were going to be delivered. They were going to be, I guess, and at that time your people. And again, I also do take that before that, because Matthew chapter 24 says when you see the sign of the abomination that you should flee. It can't be something that, it has to be like what Armand was saying about the armies being encircled. There was time for you to see it and say, let's go.
Right, 66 AD. Yeah.
It wasn't like, oh, because if they were already inside the temple, it would be too late already. So there has to be some, time for them to actually leave. And I just think, again, like consistently, I mean, I think the most consistent, like Matthew chapter 16, 27, 28 is the same thing Matthew chapter 24 is talking about. Same thing.
I get that, but
consistently, I don't think you could take it any of. I mean, I know how people do take it other ways, but I just don't see you would have to take the phrase rewarding each man according to his work and completely make that mean something completely different. And if you go to any other place where that phraseology is used, it would be the reward. It would be the, what you would say is the second coming.
Yeah, well, it could be used in other contexts. I mean, I'm sure
do you have any other like another place where that's used?
Well, I think Paul, when he's writing to the Romans, doesn't he say something more specific? Well, my point, by the way, with mentioning that was that I don't necessarily think it has to be limited to one, event or something like that. Kind of like our apocalypse.
That's like the historicist stuff.
Like the falling. Sorry, what?
That's like the whole historicist thing, that it constantly gets fulfilled, right?
Well, no, not just. Well, no, that's separated from that. Well, my point is just in terms of how phrases are used in Scripture. Kind of like like the stars falling from heaven thing, right? Yeah. That's used in a bunch of different places in Scripture of different prophecies, right? So, I mean, the phrase, but God is going to render, or Christ is going to render every man according to his work. That could be used in a bunch of different prophecies. That could apply from our perspective. That could apply to the second.
But I mean, the thing is when you see the language, the stars falling and the heavens rolling up, like I would take that in every instance apocalyptic language, not something literal.
For sure.
When I read, but when you go to Matthew chapter 16, you say, oh, well, you have to read that in another. You have to look at how that language is used. But if you look at how that language is used, it's always talking about, like, don't you believe that when Jesus does come, in your understanding, that he will reward each man according to his work?
Sure, but I'm not sure if maybe we're talking past each other or something. So my point is just the phrase, like, reward every man according to his work, that, like I said, can be used like in multiple different contexts, hypothetically. Now, I don't know.
Do you have any scripture?
Well, so for instance, in Romans chapter 2, Paul says that God will render to every man according to his deeds, both Jew and Gentile, right?
Exactly. And when was that going to be? When? That's what I'm talking about. Like, of course, it's used other places, but I think it's not a metaphoric. It's not a.
Do you
symbolic...
think that well, see, again, this goes back to the point, I guess. Paul's writing to Romans when he said that, right?
Yeah,
so, I mean, do you think that he judged all the Romans according to their deeds in 70 AD?
To the believers, and like I said again, the judgment was not just. And like I said before, if you go back in the recording, I said that it was not just Jerusalem.
Okay, but see, well, I guess maybe there's a couple directions we could go there from that point. Then I guess, I mean,
but the biggest thing is you just showed a scriptural passage that still proves that rewarding each man or giving to whatever, like, it's still a literal thing. It's not a symbolic of something else. So when
I'm not saying it's symbolic. I never said it was symbolic. I'm just saying it can be applied in different contexts to any sort of act of judgment. I mean, don't you think when God, when he judged, Egypt, when he had sucked the Assyrians on Egypt, he was rewarding them according to their deeds? Or when he judged, Babylon, or what I mean? Like, all I'm saying is that.
No, of course. But the context. What I'm trying to make but my context is I see this coming in the kingdom, but it says that it was going to happen. Those people that were standing there, they would see that. So how I read that is, okay, so Jesus is going to come with the kingdom, with the glory, right? And reward each man according to his work, and they were going to see it. So it's not just Matthew chapter 24 that's 70 AD. It's Matthew 16 that's 70 AD, not the ascension.
Sure.
That's my point. Because you had said it was because I know there's like three interpretations. It's either Matthew chapter 17, the transfiguration. It's either the ascension or the resurrection or the ascension, and then my interpretation, which would be 70 AD. And I think consistently 70 AD fits the best. That's all I'm trying to say.
Yeah, I get it. Yeah, my point is just about when you talk about the phrase "every man reward every man according to his deed." Like I said again, it's just my point is just that, and this is also technically why, like I said, it could hypothetically. I don't hold to a super solid position on what it's referring to in Matthew 16, but like I said again, it wouldn't be a huge issue for me if it does have reference to 70 AD, and it goes back to my point. Why? Because it's used in different contexts. Even in the Old Testament, I believe there's a passage actually where God's judging Israel. Now, unless you would say that passage is talking about 70 AD, but I'm pretty sure it's talking about.
No, I guess I just misunderstood you saying that because you had said it was referring to the ascension. So I was like, well, I don't see how.
Well, I'm talking about hold on. I'm talking about coming in His kingdom. So the way that I understand coming in His kingdom, I kind of view it as like. It does have reference to the ascension, but it's more than that. Because in Daniel 7, it's not just the Son of Man coming before the Ancient of Days. The Son of Man is given authority to exercise over the kingdoms and nations and things like that. So when
as a past perfect, in other words, that it starts and then it continues from then on.
Sure, yeah, that's a really good way of putting it. Yeah, and like I said, I would connect that imagery to the general sort of cloud riding motif that we see elsewhere in Scripture. That when God delivers Israel from their enemies, that they'll say things like, Yahweh came down, riding on a cherub, and he treaded upon the high places, or they use that kind of language in a lot of ways. And what I see in Daniel 7 is that now you've got the Son of Man being granted that authority. You've got the Son of Man coming before the Ancient of Days. He's given all authority in heaven and on earth, and he's the one riding the cloud. He's the one exercising the judgment. The Father has committed all judgment under the Son, right? So that's sort of the way that I view that. So in terms of like Matthew 16, that could be a reference to 70 AD. It could also be a reference to the ascension, either way, on my view, because that was literally fulfilled with the disciples. They did witness, in a sense, the enthronement of Christ when he ascended into a cloud.
But I just don't want to divorce it also from the coming with the reward. See, again, like how I think it's more consistent to go to that same language, just like you did with Daniel chapter 12 and Daniel 11, to go to Matthew chapter 24, and it says here, and then the sign of the Son of Man will appear in the heavens, and all the tribes of the land will wail, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven and with power and much glory. And he will send out his angels with a great sound and have a large trumpet, and they will gather his chosen ones from the four winds, from the four corners of the earth. From one sky. So it's like this.
Is that the context there is judgment language. So, again, like I said, I would just connect that to the same ideas that I already expounded upon, like from the Old Testament, that, Yahweh judged Egypt. He came to Egypt riding on a cloud.
Exactly. And I'm saying Matthew chapter 16 is coming in judgment, is coming in 70 AD as the destruction of the temple with the angels rewarding each man according to his work.
Yeah. Sure.
And again, those people would see the sign of this. They would see that those people standing there, they would be witnesses to that. Which again, according to Matthew chapter 24 says, and all these things will happen in this generation. Hence,
right. And that fits with my interpretation.
Exactly. Yeah. So I would say.
So my point, I guess, is just so I don't really know where we landed there.
Because you said Matthew 16 was the ascension, I think more contextually and consistently.
Oh, okay, I see what you're saying.
70 AD.
Okay, yeah, and my point was just that it's a little bit. There's some room for flexibility in my understanding of it, where I'm saying it could apply to both. Like it could, like what Stacey pointed out. It continues. I
just don't see the rewarding.
And like I said, though, see that goes back to my other point. Is like, it seems like we're pretty much agreeing on that point. At least Matthew 24, as far as Matthew 24 is concerned, the point is just that that's more of, I guess, like an argument we would use against the preterist understanding of that, because we were just saying there's no reason to assume it's talking about the second coming, given that we have a scriptural background to help us interpret it. You know what I mean? Like, if we didn't have any language like this from Daniel 7 or Isaiah 19 or 2 Samuel 22 or whatever, then okay, yeah, sure, maybe we could say that this is talking about the second advent, but we know that this is just biblical apocalyptic language being used, and it fits perfectly. Because it's
where else do you see this second advent then?
Yeah, so just in scripture, no. So in scripture, elsewhere, when the apostles talk about the second coming of Christ, they don't talk about him, coming on a cloud and things like that. They're talking about him, using very specific language that is not, being borrowed from Isaiah or Daniel. When Paul talks about him specifically saying he will descend from heaven, he does say things like we'll be caught up to meet him in the clouds, but that's not the same thing as the apocalyptic language being used by Christ in Matthew 24. Paul says he's going to come with fire, to reward every man. Well, I don't know if he uses that phrase in Thessalonians. I'd have to look it up, but there's more specific, language there. I would even connect also in Revelation 20. Now, this is kind of more of a debatable one, but I would even say that the fire coming down from heaven at the end of the 1,000 years in Revelation is talking about the second coming as well. So it's more so associated with fire. It's associated with him specifically descending from the sky, not this language of you're going to see him riding on a cloud. That's something very specific.
As we like to say here, he is not Goku, right?
Right. Yeah. There you go. Yeah. So that's what my point would be. Just those are two different things.
I got you.
So you look at 2 Peter 3 as being fulfilled. Fire language.
2 Peter 3. I tend to view it as future. That's not to say I view everything as like super literal, because there is some kind of interesting language being used there. Part of me doesn't want to say it's fulfilled because I love using this passage against premillennialists, but it could be, but I'm not really convinced so far.
Right. Well, we do have a lot of fire passages in the Old Testament that refer to judgment. Like Malachi chapter 4.
Right.
Isaiah 66.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, and there's even some difficulty in those passages also. One thing I've found is especially when you're reading guys like Malachi or Isaiah, the thing I've noticed, there's a lot of passages there where you can be reading it and you're like, okay, cool, this is talking about the Babylonian captivity or something, and then it'll say something that just completely throws it, and you're like, wait a minute, I don't think this happened during the Babylonian captivity. You know what I mean? So even like with a passage like Isaiah 66, I would say that there's still more study that has to be done, not just on my part, but I think just in general, I think that there's more discussion that has to be had about those sorts of passages because, it's kind of tricky when you're reading the prophets. There's certain areas where it seems very clear as to what it's talking about, but then there's other passages where it's like, well, wait a minute, is this talking about the second coming, or did this happen before Jesus was born? What is this talking about? So for all I know, Isaiah 66 could actually be, a prophecy of the second advent when it talks about the Lord coming with fire and his sword and things like that. But I'm kind of open on that. So
yeah, pretty cool.
Hey, Victor.
Hey guys, how you doing?
Hey.
Yo. I guess we definitely did talk about a whole bunch of stuff.
Yeah, it was good.
We can keep going for days.
Yeah, I mean, I think for the most part, I guess we both somewhat understand each other's perspective. That's for sure.
Yeah. This is good.
Yeah.
And we'd like to do that so that we don't have to bombard someone else.
Yeah, I'll have to keep messaging you anymore.
Reading the Bible, we can say, well, this is how Tyler would interpret it.
Yeah.
I'm just saying, like, when you read 17 and he's talking about the fornication, like, how can you commit fornication? Like, what?
Wait, what are you talking about?
This is totally not actual fornication, right? This is against.
You lost me, Albert.
It says in 17. It says, and there came an angel. The angel said, right, with whom the kings of the earth have committed fornication.
Right.
Okay.
Well, who that? Because that's the city that's gonna be. That's the whore right there. Like that.
For
that
sure.
right there.
And actually, you guys are all wrong. The whore is actually Islam. So
yeah, right. It's actually New York. That's who it is.
Of course.
I'm probably gonna have to bleep that out later.
I remember. I used to be really heavily into Islam. Like that was the Antichrist. Until my friend, the guy that came on here before, Armand, we were like, all right, well, let's go through Matthew 24. And I was like, oh. And then it took me like 2 years to, continue. We had on here one time William Bell.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, he came on here.
I know you guys had Sam Frost on here before, right? I think I actually saw a video you guys did. Sam Frost. Sam Frost.
Yeah. He came on here probably at least like 3 or 4 times.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, he was really cool to talk to. And, he's like, I guess, like the man to talk about the what is wrong with full preterism. But for the most part, he was like all about like the confessions of like the Westminster or whatever.
Right. Yeah, he's like hardcore reformed. Huh?
Yeah.
Or by the Bible and just the Bible by itself.
Yeah, that's what he said. Like if you just use the Bible, full preterist. But because of the confessions and stuff. I mean, but most of us here do, I guess, agree with the Reformed theology, whatever you want to call it. Name.
Same. Yeah.
But there's little variations here and there, but for the most part, we like to call it. Well, I like to call. I don't know about Stacy anymore, but the 6 points, not 5 points. We're 6 pointers.
Oh, okay. What's the 6 point?
S. The sovereignty.
Oh, okay, sure. Yeah.
Actually, I think James White. I think he's the one that I guess capitalized on that one. He called it tulips.
Oh, okay.
I currently am sort of challenging one part of the Reformed document. That is.
So when it says in 17:6, and I saw the woman drunken with the blood of the saints.
Yeah.
Why is he wondering with great admiration? Why is he doing that?
Yeah, and for the record too, this is actually another reason why I mentioned earlier. I do think Rome and Jerusalem are actually the two closest contenders, in my opinion, which I stated at the beginning. I do think that there are some good.
What else do you see for Rome? Because I just don't see Rome at all.
There would be a few things. I mean, most of it would be, like I mentioned earlier, the background stuff in terms of like who you think the main players are in Daniel, because Revelation is a continuation of that. Who do you think the preceding chapters have been dealing with? Like, where is it taking place? But then other than that, when you talk about specifically Revelation 17, a lot of it is, applicable to both, in my opinion, to Rome. And I would even say pagan and papal Rome. It's applicable to both of them and Jerusalem. So,
but who do you
in my opinion,
but doesn't it make more sense though, like to think about like Jerusalem, God's bride, That like
being
they
like
were
a harlot.
divorced. Yeah, they're the only people.
Well, see, now
in the
that's
Bible
the interesting thing, right?
Harlot,
That's the interesting thing about it. And this is, I feel like when you examine the distinctions between preterism and historicism, the similarities and distinctions, in my opinion, are very interesting to look at. Because if you do think that the papacy and the Roman Catholic Church and all that stuff are involved in Bible prophecy, we would use a lot of the same reasoning that you're using. You know what I mean? Because the idea there with both interpretations is there's this apostate group of some kind, right, that was in relationship or covenant or whatever language you want to use, and she's being judged for her apostasy, for her harlotry, right? And even when you get into like the idea of like Jerusalem, or spiritual Israel or any of that kind of thing, the same sort of principle still applies to either, position.
So would you say, for instance, that when we talk about what you mentioned before, the colors of war, you can either refer to it as the priest of Jerusalem at that time in their garment, or the paschal gowns that they had. Different.
Yeah, that's my point. You could apply it to both. I mean, in fact, you could even apply. What's interesting about the purple and scarlet, you could even apply that to the Roman Caesars, who used to wear purple and scarlet, and the papacy actually borrowed that from them.
But now, were they ever in a relationship with the Father, though? Biblically speaking, that's my main point.
Sure.
You can only be
if it's talking about apostasy, then in a sense, yes, because we're talking about an apostate group or an apostate church.
You first had to have been in a relationship with the person in the first place. So,
right, exactly. I mean, that's why they're called apostates.
When did Rome have a relationship with the Father?
Well, so it was the church. Well, you know what the definition of apostasy is, right? It's you're falling away.
Yeah, you fell away. So you would have to first be in first.
Well, but you're not a hyper-preterist, right? You still believe that salvation is available after 70 AD, right?
Of course.
Well, there you go. Right? I mean, that's...
But you're saying, if you say that the papacy, that office is it, when was the papacy, of God or of salvation? Like, when was that organization?
Okay. So it's not. Well, we're not saying that there was like this institution called the papacy that was like totally righteous and doing everything right, and then it fell off or something. We're saying the whole point of it is, when we talk about apostasy, we're talking about people who are apostatizing from the faith, from the church, from the true church, from the true body of Christ, right? And they're going off and doing their own thing. That's literally what apostasy entails, and that's what the Roman Catholic institution is. So that's what and this would also, again, this, like I said, there's a lot of different facets to this. So, this would go into like the man of sin prophecy in 2 Thessalonians. This would go into our understanding of like the two beasts in Revelation 13 and that kind of thing. But yeah, so we're not saying like, hey, there was the Roman Catholic Church and they were like this totally righteous church, but then they just started, no, it's individuals from amongst the true body of believers
that went off and started the Roman Catholic Church, is what you're saying.
Yeah, apostasy. Gotcha. Yeah, so. And like I said, to go back to my other point, that's another reason why, like I said, in a lot of ways, there's similarities between our two positions. And that's another reason why, like I said, in Revelation 17, I do admittedly think, it could go both ways. And I think that we have to examine the rest of the biblical data to kind of help us come to a better, clearer understanding of that.
Yeah, that's what I do like about the preterist view, is that you actually go to the Bible.
For sure, yeah.
When you go any other interpretation of eschatology, you have to go outside the Bible.
Yeah.
You can't
it depends on
a verse and say, look, you can't go and say papacy, look, they're the whore according to anywhere. Like, I can go multiple places in the Bible and show Jerusalem was a whore. She played the harlot. She was divorced. She was judged. And, and then according to the New Testament, they were about to be judged.
Right.
So
it depends upon. It kind of begs the question as to, again, your overall viewpoint, and do you think everything had to be fulfilled by the first century, I guess, and that's where, if these are actual predictions, that were intended to extend beyond the first century, then of course we have to go outside of the Bible, because the prophecies, were about institutions that were not, the thing about it is you can do that with other Bible prophecy. I mean, we can go to Daniel 8, and we can look at like the book of 1st and 2nd Maccabees. Not that I think those books are like scripture or anything, but we can go to those historical sources and we can be like, hey, look, and this guy named Antiochus fulfills all these prophecies perfectly, and that we read in Daniel 8. I mean, we can go to a history.
Like there's verses. Like Nebuchadnezzar fulfills certain things and stuff like that. But I think for the most part of Daniel, like you have to take the whole thing and say, okay, well, at the end of the iron and the clay, at that time, the 70 weeks, you have Daniel 12, the destruction of the holy people. So that's the thing. Like I would say that the Roman Catholic Church is not the holy people at that time. It was Israel. They were the holy people, that their power was completely shattered.
Right. Yeah.
Because
and then
as a whole, the church, they're not like
that. Kind of connects to the other point that we kind of left off on earlier, which was about how we understand 12:11 and the abomination of desolation and all that other stuff. Because that's the other point, I guess, is that, and for the record too, I mean, in my own experience, when I was studying preterism, something like that view of like Daniel 12:11 wasn't even something I was aware of when I was like a preterist. Like I didn't come across that until after I had become more convinced of historicism. But it's kind of like what you said earlier. There are sort of what you would call problem passages, and every position does have objections to it, But when I look at, like I said, just certain things, it's like I can totally see, okay, I'm reading this passage, and this has a historical referent. This has to have been fulfilled already. But there's other places where it's like, well, I don't really see how that could be fulfilled already. And it's not just that, but it's just, is there a reason to go that far? And the thing that I kind of went through, and I kind of explained this to you the other day actually on Facebook, but it was like, I remember studying Revelation, and I was like a hardcore, like super into like partial preterism, and I'm like, Nero was the Antichrist, and all this other stuff. And I was like, continuing my studies or whatever, and I just started noticing little things here and there where I was like, I don't really know how to reconcile that. And I was listening to a lot of guys. I was even listening to some full preterists. I listened to some of Don Preston's stuff. I really liked listening to like Ken Gentry. I bought Ken Gentry's book on the dating of Revelation, and a lot of these guys, and I was trying to find like, well, what are they saying about X, Y, and Z thing that I'm having trouble with, and it kind of caused more problems than it solved for me, versus when I started entertaining the historicist viewpoint. The way I looked at it was, we can still be consistent. We can still, look at a passage like Matthew 24 and put that in its proper historical framework. We can still acknowledge the time statements. We don't have to monkey around with the time statements like the futurists do, But at the same time, it filled in a lot of those gaps for me that I wasn't able to fill in or, reconcile when I was trying to fit everything into the first century, And so I think that's kind of that's definitely one of the main things that did it for me, was that got me to kind of take another look at, where I was going in terms of my eschatology. Because, I mean, I basically already explained. I don't want to like be repetitive or anything, but I hope you get what I'm saying.
Yeah, somewhat. I mean, everybody has like some issues and stuff. Like, everybody has those passages that we can't explain, and that's why like when we talk about like full preterism and things like that, I always put it like a puzzle. When you start a puzzle, you start with the edges. So with eschatology, you need to start with the time statements, the manner, the different languages that Israel, or that they would use, the hyperbolic and all
right,
that
yeah,
kind of
the
stuff.
idioms and stuff. Yeah, for sure.
That's the outside puzzle pieces that you can connect. Then you work your way in, and then you can figure out, like, how did the resurrection happen. But I still think that we could never truly understand all that stuff at the moment. But I just think for the most part, to be consistent with my view, I would have to say the first century, because of Daniel chapter 2, Matthew 24, the book of Hebrews, just to be consistent. Like, of course, it would be awesome to wake up one day and, the heavens roaring and all that stuff, and, right. Like the movies. I mean, that sounds cool,
that would be
but
pretty terrifying. I don't want to go through that.
I just want to be consistent with what I see in Scripture, and to be consistent, I don't see it truly any other way. And I mean, it's not like I came to this going like, oh, this is the greatest thing. It took me like 2 years to actually be like, yep, full preterism. If you stick with just the Bible, I don't know how you can go around it. But if you go outside the Bible, then yes, anything can be anything.
Yeah. And that would just go, that goes back to just the difference in, I guess, interpretation, or in terms of, like,
it means you can't use Irenaeus. You can't do it.
Yeah, right, yeah, like, what, were these prophecies intended to extend, beyond that or whatever? Yeah, that's the I guess the main question that you have to, if not start with, that you also have to kind of deal with, I suppose, is just, because that's going to influence, obviously, which position you land on, to some extent. I mean,
just like a roulette table.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, yeah, for the most part, I guess.
I was just. You were saying? I was saying 69, 70, right? That's how you count, right? You go like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, right? You don't just like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Hold on, it's going to be like 17,000 years in between here. Then we'll go.
Right. Yeah.
What did you say, Stacy?
42. That's the answer.
Of the universe. 42. Yeah. Well, I mean, some pretty good stuff.
Yeah, it was a lot of fun.
Yeah, I had a ball.
Great. I appreciate you guys having me on.
I mean,
I caught part of it, I guess.
Well, what?
I'll still be here regardless. I'm going to push an end to the recording, but
yeah, you can push an end to the recording.
Cool.
But there'll still be people here.
Yeah, I don't know what happened to Armin. He said he was working, right?
Yeah.
He just messaged and asked if we were still on.
Oh, tell him to come on. I mean, I just have to wake up at like whenever my son wakes up tomorrow, probably like 6. But I mean, it's okay.